Welcome to the Bayesian Conspiracy. I'm Eneasz Brodsky.
I'm Steven Zuber.
And I'm Brandon Hendrickson.
Brandon Hendrickson, welcome back. We had you on last episode and we ran out of time and we just could not give up talking about the subject because it's awesome.
That's awesome. Sorry. I was reflecting today on how when I wrote the whole book review, right? I put my brain to the absolute max of what I was able to do for 4 or 5 months. And my only hope in the entire thing was that maybe some people, this will make them think about and consider the ideas of Kieran Egan. And the only actual taktarget that I had was making the top 10 or 12 or whatever ended up being cut off for that. So, the entire readership of Scott Alexandra's Substack would be able to, argue about it and whatever. And when I achieved that, I'm like, okay, great. I've done my due diligence here. I can go home. And so last episode, when you guys, I heard you guys taking with some of these ideas, right? And running with them and applying them to things. I was just so flipping stoked about that. This is everything that I worked for and more. So thank you so much for just honoring me with this opportunity.
Well, thanks for the fuel. I mean, this is a really cool idea I never would have come across otherwise. So, and I don't have any kids. I don't plan on having kids, but I have three, I have 2 nieces and 1 nephew. And I know they're not going to whatever standard primary school, but anything I can do to make learning more exciting for them, I'm planning on trying to indoctrinate them with. I'm right now. I don't know a lot of I guess whatever. Stopped at college basic algebra, but I plan to do my best to make math fun for them.
Yeah,
because math is one of those subjects where I think it just the fun of it gets beaten out of kids really fast.
Yeah.
And there's a huge fear component to looking stupid or being called stupid by your peers, and that makes them hate the subject, and they shouldn't hate it.
Yeah, math is by far the hardest one to make fun if you aren't just naturally a math cell. As long as we're talking about math, we can go ahead and jump right into this. You have a thing about how jokes is the perfect way to teach math class.
This is the weirdest. I can point my finger at this as the one oddest sounding recommendation that Kieran Egan ever gives in all of his books. and so it is the one that I feel I must keep my distance from the most. But I find the logic behind it really interesting, which is that, the role of math in the curriculum is to train in analytical thinking. And it's really hard because, analytical thinking past a certain kind of easy level is this alien-ish thing for human minds. We didn't really invent it until, 500 BCE, in Miletus in Turkey. And it does not come naturally to most people. Some people, yes. And so Egan says, okay, if that's the kind of thinking that we want to train, where else do we see throughout human culture, throughout human history, those kinds of mental moves popping up? And he points out that one of the places that we see it is in comedy, is in humor, where you have to, in order to make a joke actually land perfectly, you have to get every gosh darn piece of the thing to work together, right? Every joke is this little mechanism that you put the gears together and you wind it up just so, and then you place it in somebody's hand and poof, there it goes. And so by paying this really close attention to jokes, not just, as a critics, but then as makers of jokes or whatever, right? You can engage kids in that kind of analytical, systematic thinking that can then help them develop those skills that are also useful in math. And I know I just need to say that what this should not be understood as is Egan is actually at pains to say that he's not saying, okay, so for the first 4 years, let's scrape out the math curriculum and let's put it in the funny curriculum. Nothing like that at all. But I think that insofar as it can be useful to examine things really closely that are funny as a way of building analytical skills, I think that I have firsthand evidence of that. One of the things that I've done kind of taking off of this idea is I run a once a week close reading class where we take comics for the last few last year or two, we've done various volumes of Calvin and Hobbes.
Ooh, a good one.
It's so great, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we, we'll do 10 or 15 pages a week, and we meet on Zoom, and the kids will say, okay, they'll pick strips that they want to read out loud, and they have to perform them. And then we will just say, okay, what makes this joke funny? Let's get all analytical on this. And frequently, the kids have no idea what makes it funny, which is weird because they almost always find it funny. This is also a way of building vocabulary and building a knowledge of the world, right? I don't think I would really understand what ZZ Top was as a band in the 80s if I didn't read Calvin and Hobbes, and various things of, obviously philosophy, science, cosmology. But beyond all of that, beyond all the content knowledge that one gets, it is a way of being stupidly, irritatingly analytical. And parents have told me that, so there's going to be some selection effect here or whatever. But parents have told me, I've never been able to get my kids to do this, deep of thinking on anything, as they do reading Calvin and Hobbes and talking about it in class. So yeah, I think to some extent, I can say I'm pretty confident that the funnies in elementary school to boost math skills are probably good.
I have two anecdotes related to that. One tortured analogy. The anecdote is that I think with them reading Calvin and Hobbes in an analytical way, so they could talk about it. Having done a couple of long form book readings, where it takes 2 years to read through a book because you're spending 2 hours a week discussing bits, along the way. That made me a better reader and a better consumer of all things. I think fiction, probably other stuff if I looked at it, but. Just being primed to engage with the content a certain way for long enough once or twice in my case, I think helped me to establish just new tools and lenses to look at stuff through. And the other thing with comedy is I doubt this is where Egan's going, but I think this analogy works where it's because right now, at least in my recollection of math classes, it's all right, let's look at this thing for 2 weeks. All right, now we're moving on over here, and now this thing, and none of them relate together. And that to me is kind of like watching the last 15 minutes of an hour long stand up set, and then jumping to another comedian rather than getting the whole hour. So to stretch the analogy, I remember once 10 years ago showing somebody the last few minutes of a comedy set because I listened to the whole thing on the radio or I guess on Pandora or something when I was driving down the highway, to the point where I was wiping tears out of my eyes laughing while driving on the interstate. And I was sharing the last bit with a friend, the part that had me in stitches, and he wasn't really laughing. He's like, "Oh man, that guy's got some dark humor there." And I was like, "Well, no, it's because you didn't." Then I realized he didn't get the hour before that to realize this guy's not a psychopath, right? He just got the part that I thought was the funniest at the end. And you really do need to build that foundation. And then when it all kind of comes home at the end, it's based on this this more fundamental understanding of where everything is coming from. So actually, apropos that, but not related to math or Egan, if you do want to share comedians with people, I recommend finding their 5-minute segments they've done rather than sending them your favorite bit. Find their 5 minutes on Conan or something, because that's something they've actually calculated out to be their 5 minutes, not a chopped, bit of this part will be funny. Right.
Yeah.
But I do think that there's something there about just taking the time to build all the stuff you need to, again, have the ending make sense, right? Have the ending land how it's supposed to. So if you're working your way through, I don't know, algebra, you'd have someone who knows more math, and then you'd have to think of a way to actually relate this to math to see if it actually lands. But tell me if I'm on anything like the right track. I'm totally fine with being off base here.
What I'm hearing from you is that humor, to be really properly understood, needs to be understood in its whole context. As small things are pieces of the whole, which is different, right, than the part that I was emphasizing, which is the doing an analytical read on a thing, because you were more experiencing it and not being analytical about what is it that makes this funny. But then you were moved to be more analytical about, oh yeah, I guess taken out of context, this person just sounds like they would try to harvest my organs for profit or something like that. Am I getting what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. The bit about just kind of getting the background context to where now the end isn't just this bit of stuff that you memorized for a test or whatever. It's oh, okay, now I understand it, Given the foundation that's been built here, I can see, how this got here in a way that makes sense.
Conveyor belts is the way that I think about this, is the way that I think about how we tend to do math classes. And this is strictly speaking not Egan, or at least it's not unique to Egan. But most kids' experience of a math class is, okay, like today we're doing X and tomorrow we're doing Y and the next day we're doing H. or psi or omicron or something, right? Like these things are disjointed from one another. And when my wife and I full-time taught did the upper elementary curriculum for a startup school outside of Seattle, one of the things that we did was we called them boss problems. Just on the video game analogy of like the boss fight at the end of every level, where at the beginning of every lesson, we would start by giving the kids some ludicrously hard problem that we made up that like took all of the things that they would learn, the concepts that they would master in the course of that one lesson, and made it this problem so that if they can do this problem, like they probably understand the lesson. And then we made the problem ridiculous. We made it over the top and whatever. And we started the lesson, every lesson, just by saying, okay, like here's the boss problem for today. Does anyone want to take a crack at that? That would be great because it would give them some interest, right, in what they were then going to be learning about. And, oftentimes halfway through the lesson, a kid would go, oh my gosh, I think I know how to do it. Okay, we'd pause everything. Pause everything while the kids like then go ahead and try the boss problem. And, sometimes they could get it and sometimes they couldn't, but now they would have another specific question, right? They would recognize like, I don't know how to do this thing. We also did, I think we called them mega boss questions, where at the beginning of every unit, we would just make these, actually invest some time into making these even harder problems and more ridiculous problems. And we'd paste them on the wall. And the kids, it'd spend like a half an hour at the beginning of every week or month or whatever it was, looking at the problems and trying to do the problems and then writing questions down on the poster that we put up with each problem on it that we put up on the wall. So they were kind of like getting ready to think about these sorts of things. And then when they actually, at the end of the unit, right, if they hadn't already solved it, they'd come back to these and go, oh my gosh, of course, yes. And it's amazing how, I guess in some ways this is deeply Egan. It's amazing how like that sense of continuity and that sense of like callbacks, that sense of like, this is a piece that reflects on the whole, how big of a psychological, a motivational difference that will make for kids. I say that maybe it is Egan because Egan's like whole spiel is, when it comes like to science and math, is like take the techniques that storytellers have come up with, that like Pixar has come up with and whatever, novelists, take those to be maybe absurdist poets, I don't know, right? Take those techniques and use them to teach everything. And, this whole idea of like having callbacks, having through lines. This is a major element. Ines, you can speak to this and tell me if I'm wrong, of how good fiction often works. And something as silly as like jumping off of the conveyor belt by building these callbacks in. I got to write a blog post about this. It can be magical. We had kids who hated math, were anxious about math, who would just get stymied and give up whenever they had anything, whenever they had any kind of snag, who by the end of like a few years, like, I've gotten emails from moms years later saying like, oh, like my daughter is in, middle school now or high school now, and she is one of the best kids in math in our class, and she really loves being challenged in math. It's like, yes, this is what I did this for.
That's got to be so rewarding.
I remember in my AP Physics class in high school, we re-derived E equals MC squared. And like we were not told at the beginning this is what we were doing. We were just doing various experiments and, running the formulas and shit on them. And like it was in the last day or last couple days, we're a few steps away from actually getting to E equals MC squared. And you see where all of the formulas are trending. And then when you're like, oh my fucking God, we recreated the steps. This is amazeballs. Just because it's the most famous formula.
You feel a little like Einstein.
Yeah.
I also really like in the
teacher planned this, right? Like this was like the
Oh,
big plan of impeachment. Oh, it's so, and he or she didn't like tell where you were going ahead of time.
No, it was one of the last things we did of the year. It was so cool once you realize what is happening.
Oh,
It kind of sucks that you had to wait until AP Physics in high school for that to happen, you know?
Yeah.
Because, like, this could have been done with, 10-year-olds and Pythagorean's theorem.
I mean, specifically, this one might not have been able to because the math equations around light are a little... They start getting more difficult, I think, but they're not that bad.
No, that's why I use Pythagorean theorem instead, because that's just, squares.
Right, yeah.
So I think kids, younger kids could follow that. When you use the word boss battle, or your boss question, I just gotta mention that I think for a lot of kids, math is a lot like playing Dark Souls. And every time you try and go face it, you get your ass stomped over and over and over. And then you're like, oh, I finally got this. I got it. Oh, damn it. There's a whole second phase to this fight. But then when you get done, it's this whole victory, right?
Yeah.
I was perusing your Substack, and God, I loved the solar system blog so much.
Yes.
I was wondering, Steve, you're going to love this. Does this count as a boss question? At the beginning, you put up a picture of the solar system, common model, and it has the words "planets orbit the sun" on it. And it feels like the boss question is when you say almost every word in this picture is a lie. Like it turns out the only one that isn't a lie is the word "the," and figuring out why it is that almost every word in that picture is a lie is it's true. Why that's the case, it feels like a boss battle itself as you guide everyone through that. Although I'm not sure you could. I don't know. Does that count as a boss question? Because I'm not sure you could get that on your own without being walked through it.
Okay, so I'm embarrassed that I just reacted so excitedly when you mentioned that post. Right? Like this is
it's so good.
One is not supposed to react that way toward one's own writing, but I am so proud of that post. It's the second lesson in the whole science course, online science course that I do, but. Every part, whenever I teach a lesson, I teach it 5 times and it grows and changes every single time until by the end, it's usually something really great. But it wasn't until I was 9/10 of the way through teaching that particular lesson, that particular time, that I actually had oh my gosh, every single picture of the solar system that I've ever seen is literally facing the wrong direction. Once you understand Newton, you understand why you should to say orbiting is wrong. Orbiting is a stupid word, and we should physically be conceptualizing the solar system in a different way. I think I might be the first person to say this too. I feel very proud of this. I'm probably not, but I've never read it anywhere. And so, yeah, should I give it away right now or should I not? Here, I can answer the actual concrete question that you asked. How about that? Does that count as a boss question? It's interesting. When I started at the very beginning of the pandemic, when I started Science is Weird, I was influenced by the boss questions or boss problems, or whatever I call them, to have some kind of interesting question at the beginning of every science lesson. And in that very first week that I was doing it over Zoom in the pandemic, I had one lesson that didn't do that didn't start with a riddle, and it went terribly. And I realized, this is the secret for teaching science online. It's you start you organize the entire lesson around one simple question that it really feels like the kid really makes the kid really feel like they should be able to answer right now. The answer must be obvious. It must be staring them in the face. And it actually kind of has to be that. It can't be something that they didn't know about before.
Okay.
And then you take the entire lesson, and instead of being now I will give you the information, it's now I will give you clues and hints that will allow you to get to the answer. You together as a class will put together the answer to this in chunks and pieces. By this point of it, we usually have 3 or 4 chapters in every lesson where they kind of solve some other piece in it. I give them a Mad Lib style hint at the beginning where I just take out all the crucial words and so they can guess more easily, whatever. And then I dangle for them as the clues and the hints, what Egan would call the bonus à penser, the privileged forms of knowledge, vivid images and stories, and sometimes like wonky diagrams and metaphors and puzzles and whatever. And they had to kind of put those together and talk through them as a class to get to part of the answer. So yeah, you are totally correct in seeing a organic connection between the math boss problems and what I've done with the science what I'm doing with the science curriculum. Frankly, I'd forgotten that. So thank you.
No, yeah, no problem. Thank you for the post. I don't think we should spoil it here. This will motivate people to go and look up the post itself. And also, as you say in the post, that this is a 90-minute lesson, so it would probably take up most of the podcast. So we will provide a link to that, and anyone who wants to go can go and read it. It is absolutely fascinating and delightful to read. Like, you write the same way that you talk. It is a pleasure. Your footnotes, absolutely everybody should check out the footnotes because they are also fantastic little bits, and include, before I forget, a thing I wanted to ask you about. You go through the naming of the planets and how each further outnamed planet was named one generation earlier in the Greek gods. That and so when they finally got to Orobus, the final god who birthed all the other gods, who was the namesake of Uranus, or Uranus, if you prefer, you said they ran out of the gods. The next planet discovered was named George. I swear I'm not making this up.
So William Herschel and his sister, Anne, Mary, I can't remember, Elizabeth, some Victorian name, or Georgian name, I suppose. They built, like maybe the biggest telescope that existed ever in the history of the world. Like they had to build a new addition to their barn to house this giant telescope. He looked through the spyglass. She wrote down the numbers, and he found, this new dot in the night sky. And he recognized that it was a planet. And so the pattern for naming planets had long been the father of whoever the last planet was, right? So Mars is Ares. Ares's father is Zeus in Roman, right? Zeus pater, Jupiter. So we go Mars, Jupiter. Who is Jupiter's father? It was, Zeus's father is Kronos. There is actually in the Roman canon no real exact analog to Kronos, so they use Saturn instead. So we go Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. The next planet was then found, and that was, his father was Uranos in Greek, or Uranus in Latin, or whatever. There's a right way and a wrong way to mispronounce Latin, and I'm doing it the wrong way. And so then they found this new planet, and this is like the first planet that had been discovered. I can't remember in how long. But the problem was that Uranos was the first god. I think they could have gone to Chaos, but like Chaos is specifically not a god, right? You can't go any farther back in the Greek pantheon. So he said, this is easy. I'll just name it George after my king. King George of England. And this was so it's like Georgium Sidaris or whatever, like George's star, right? And star was a more general term back then that just meant glowy thing in the sky. My understanding of this is that actually did go for a while. Like it really was a planet named George. And until the French astronomers were like, no.
No, we're not having an English king.
The sky is for the gods, not for your stupid mad king. We don't care if you want money. You're not getting this. We're not using this.
Oh, that's too bad, because how much of a flex would it be to have one of your kings in the solar system forever? Just damn.
Yeah, right. They went with Neptune, which, brother of Zeus. So you're going in a different direction there, and you're a couple generations removed at that point. But then they get to do Pluto. So you at least have the other two brothers of Zeus that are back there.
Okay. Before we continue, sorry, Stephen, did you want to jump in with anything?
No, other than just noting that them starting, to the tradition of naming through the paternal line of God seemed like a short side. Like they must have assumed there wouldn't be that many planets, So I guess it worked for all the ones they could see at the time, and they're like, oh, okay, we're probably good. And then they had to start getting creative. So they start with George, which didn't stick, and then moved to Zeus's siblings.
That is really interesting, actually, because their conception of what a planet was, the blog post talks a bit about this, but their conception of what a planet was way more general than ours is now. Huh. Okay. I actually might start looking into that. Thank you. If I can actually make a meta point, that this sort of thing where this boring set of things that we had to learn in school. I mean, I don't think anyone's really that bored by the planets or whatever, although I used to really struggle to remember, is it Saturn first? Is it Jupiter first? This is like one of those many, many things where this knowledge, this information, it actually comes from somewhere. And when you understand the story where it comes from, you learn it naturally, which is weird because it's actually much, much more information. It's easier to learn the gods and the planets than it is to learn the planets. And maybe that's not exactly true, but it's not twice as hard to learn both of those things. And it's actually interesting. It's like the days of the week, right? We don't teach the kids where the days of the week or the months of the year come from, or why it's odd that September means the 7th month, but it's not. And October means the 8th, but it's not. November and December, right? They're off by, 2? There's a story there, there are gods and goddesses and Roman emperors with really big egos behind all of this. And we can be talking about that in the earliest grades because anybody can flipping understand a simple story about an egomaniac. But we don't, because we have this absolutely asinine understanding of what human minds are like when we're young that has not survived the test of time. Nobody is still actually working on the assumptions that that people built the social studies curriculum on 100 years ago. No one trumpets those anymore, but we just haven't gone back and rethought what are kids capable of learning in the early years and how can that build to when they get older so that they know a lot of crap and are interested in all sorts of aspects of the world.
So, okay, I'm going to jump again to a different part of my notes. I swear I'm going to get back to the earlier stuff eventually. But since you just talked about how people model young brains, you wrote in one of the other posts that the matter with schooling is that schooling doesn't matter, and schools don't matter because people assume brains are built to think. Yeah. Could you expound on that a little bit? What the heck? Aren't brains built to think?
The cognitive scientist Daniel Willingham opens up his great book, Why Don't Students Like School? With a line something like, everyone assumes that brains are built to think, but contrary to this, brains are not. And, he's a cognitive psychologist at the University of Virginia. He's done some important work on cognitive biases and on rational thinking. And he, what he means by that, what he sort of in that opening chapter of his excellent book says that brains are more built to remember things rather than dealing with a lot of random information. We have much better hard drives than we do RAM, right? It'd be one way of thinking about that. But I think that we can go further in that and say that, that this actually goes in a whole bunch of directions, right? How would you guys answer that question? What are brains built to do?
My brain jumps to the Hansonian answer of they're there to convince mates that we're, at bottom, they're there to look good, to, make us look good to potential mates. And, so whatever that means to make us feel good about ourselves by lying to ourselves or, to think of ways to posture in such a way that we seem more desirable. But that may be more of an evolutionary story than, what was the question? What are they for? Or how do they think? Or
what are they for?
Oh, they cool the blood. I forgot, of course, obviously. Yeah.
I think aliens here.
I think that's a really good answer to look good to others. I was going to go back even further and say brains are built primarily to move our bodies, but that is so reductive that I think it actually misses the point.
Yeah, right. The brain is an organ that's meant to regulate a whole bunch of things in the body. Yeah, I think that's at base the truest answer, and also misses the point of it. Yeah, it's not a particularly helpful answer. So we need to go to the next evolutionary step up and say, why do we have such big swellings of these parts of our nervous systems, right, in our heads? Yeah. And I hear, Stephen, your answer as our brains are. The purpose of our brains is to allow us to, and thinking is to allow us to survive and thrive in the natural environment.
Well, and I think specifically in the social environment, because the natural environment for humans is all other humans, basically.
Yes, exactly. Right. Like we are the animal that is weirdly built to survive, and we're like the rats of the primates, right? Like we survive in like every biome because the natural habitat of a human being is a small human community. So yeah, right. Like, so that's what we are really, really good at. And then Egan chops that down. He's kind of building on Fodor, some of the module theorists, modules of mind. That's the phrase. Mental modality. There's a word here that I'm failing to get. In the 70s and 80s, who point out that brains are weirdly good at doing certain discrete tasks. And he combines that with anthropology and says, okay, so like obviously some of those tasks, because even like the Fodor and the cognitive psychologists were ignoring like the most obvious anthropological things. Like some of them are stories. We're weirdly good storytellers. We are really good at just like making metaphors, like instantaneously. In fact, young kids seem to be better. No, not just seem to be, right? There's good evidence, studies that have been done that have actually shown that little kids are better at coming up with more metaphors and better metaphors than college undergraduates are. I don't know if that study is replicated. I should look into that. But I can give you, if you're interested, I can try to rustle up the fact or the study on that. And so like these sorts of things, which then, right, like societies use to build cultures, which, their depth are a bunch of stories and things that we pass on to one another, rituals and senses of right and wrong and whatever. And we're really good at those things. So yeah, like we should build schooling around these things that kids are really good at, which is not the same thing as thinking, when thinking is understood in a 20th century, 21st century sort of analytic modern context. I used to teach in this hippie school, and people would say things like, well, like kids are so smart, just like look at like how babies learn language. Like that's so mentally difficult. And, like the traditional answer to that is yes, that is a superpower of babies that probably gets mostly lost when we become adults. And like you are pointing to a mental module and mistaking that for people's natural analytical abilities. If we want to actually like use the tools and skills that kids have, we need to build the kinds of modern thinking that we want them to do, like math, for example, on the things that they are really good at, like stories and jokes, actually, to do a through line back to that.
The various, actually, before we get to the various ways of thinking, since you brought up math again, one thing I was thinking as we were talking earlier, but I didn't get it out there. As much as I love everything you're talking about, jokes and all that, it sort of feels like the only way to build a muscle is to, work it consistently. The only way to like get good at baseball is to just practice swinging a bat at a ball over and over again. Isn't there still going to have to be just some level of rote memorization of like memorizing what the sums of the one-digit numbers are, memorizing what the products of the one-digit numbers are, just because that's so important to be able to do in your head quickly?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so here, let me actually give a two-sided answer to that. So like my assumption is yes, absolutely. Egan's assumption was yes, absolutely. So yeah, nothing that he's saying should be interpreted, nothing that I'm saying should be interpreted as saying against that, because my goodness, it just seems like common sense and whatever. There are ways of like Eganizing, the times tables. Stephen, for your, do we have a term in our language that includes nephews and nieces?
I've heard nibblings, which I'm not the biggest fan of, but it's the closest I think we have.
That's so cute.
I like it. For your nieces and nephews, there is a piece of math curriculum that is just one of those brilliant things ever. Multiplication by heart, and the people who made it, an outfit called Math for Love. That's run by some friends of mine. I'm not getting any proceeds from this pitch. Addition by heart. It uses a bunch of Egan tools and builds in spaced repetition physical flashcards in what used to be called the Leitner box to train kids in in how to do just times tables and things like that, and to actually understand them. So there are ways of combining those together. Okay, so that was like the one side of it, like where I say, like, yeah, like we should definitely do that, and I mean that. It is an interesting open question to me when I think about how the great mathematicians of the past did not actually memorize their times tables.
Really?
Ineash, exactly what you're saying is true, right? Like to get strong at something, you have to do it again and again and again. But these were people who, just like their day in, day out, like what they were working on in their own heads were math riddles. And like you get good at those things. And I wonder if there is some sort of beautiful land that we can get to where we just have kids doing so much math that they actually don't, like, that the need for coming in to like, let's drill this and really practice this becomes sort of like a secondary thing. But that's definitely not the place to start.
Yeah. When I was in the 1 year of the Gifted and Talented program that I got before we moved, what they did was make it a competition, basically. And I don't know if this would work for kids without a competitive streak, but like the fact that we had 100 single-digit addition problems, and we had, I think it was like 5 minutes to do as many of them as we possibly could. And every time I didn't get all 100 of them done, it felt like a little failure. But like as the weeks went by and I got closer and closer to 100, it just felt better each time. And I don't know. I don't know if that would work.
I mean, it did.
People.
Aren't you saying that it did? Oh, for most people.
It totally worked for me, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, God, I'd forgotten about those.
Yeah.
I did something like that too. I'm suddenly feeling this gut punch of nostalgia for a clearer, better time where we could tell kids things like, hey, let's see if you can learn math facts quickly.
And you think of it now and you're like, can you add 7 plus 2 and similar problems 100 times in 5 minutes? It's like, are you kidding me? I could probably do it in 1 minute. But at the time, it was such a struggle.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll just point out that like competition is like, obviously like one of the most plentiful, common cultural norms.
Yeah.
Right, just think of any kind of coming of age ceremony or rite in an oral society where you just have people who are engaged in these, oftentimes like, how many wooden skewers can you stick through different parts of your body? Sort of
Right.
competitions. What we do is, at worst, is like ridiculously tame compared to that. And, I don't think we should go back to that exactly. Yeah. But I think the crucial thing there, and I'm far from the first person to say this, is that there are kids for whom competition is wonderful. There are kids for whom it destroys any desire that they will ever have to do that thing. And this is where it seems like what we want to do is create diversity in the choices of education that we have, both at the classroom level and at the school level. Do you guys know Michael Strong, the writer Michael Strong?
I don't.
This is a guy who, like, he has a track record of making successful alternative school at the rate with which I wipe my nose. This is someone, he has a Substack. It's so good. Like, when I read his stuff, I'm just like, it's scary. It's scary, like how deep and like, oh my gosh, why has no one said this before? It is. And one of his greatest posts, we can put up a link in the notes, is I forget the title of it, but it's arguing that, look, there is exactly one thing that has ever worked throughout history to educate people, and that is thick cultures. Maybe we should try that.
What is a thick culture? Because right now I'm just imagining a, fairly attractive girl.
I think I don't understand that joke, and I'm just going to walk along from that one. That's fine for me. That's actually fine for me. Like a thick culture is the sort of thing, if you imagine any like tribal people anywhere, right? Like they all are pursuing a goal together. They all have a certain set of values that they, there's always diversity in every group, but like they are basically on board with. They're striving for something. They do these, Egan would say these cognitive tools or these cultural practices that like unify them and succeed at getting, each new member born into the society to become sort of a piece of that society. it gets people to care, right? Like to want to see themselves as a person who is not an atomized individual, but somebody who is like a piece of the society and is carrying it along. And like in a thick culture, that's not his phrase, that's my phrase, or it's, I don't know, Clifford Geertz is the anthropologist's phrase or something. You have people who learn so freaking much. And of course they have to survive or whatever. And it's not the same kind of things that we learn in school, but like Michael Strong writes, like looking back through history, we make these people who are able to do amazing things because they have to in order to survive. Because, you know, nature thinks that you are delicious. It loves you so much. And we should maybe try to do this thing. We should maybe try to have thick cultures. But the way he writes that we make schools is that, I mean, speaking particularly of public schools, although a lot of private schools are kind of guilty of the same thing, we say, okay, like here is the geographic catchment area around this school. We have terribly diverse, I mean, I love diversity, but we have like very diverse groups of people who believe and want very different things. And they're all paying for this school. And their kids have to go there. So we have to like water everything down to what the values and the norms and the content that no one disagrees with. And that is just a recipe for never being able to have a thick culture.
Right.
And so like in my mind, like we will have the potential for flourishing schools everywhere when we allow for people to opt into whatever stupid kind of school, right, that they want to have their kids into. And I emphasize the stupid thing because, of course, every group's school looks stupid to every other group. And obviously some people will misuse this and it will be very bad for their kids. It just, I think, will be much better from their kids that the watered down, learning nothing, caring about nothing, having massive distraction problems and behavior problems because no one really wants to be there that much. Not that many people, maybe I shouldn't say nobody, really cares about the place and cares about the project that they are embarked in. Even like the bad situations will mostly be a lot better than those situations, than the situation that we have right now is.
Yeah, just couldn't get much worse.
I mean, it's always a bad thing to say, right? Like I get angry at my radical friends who just say, let's blow up the system because shrug, probably nothing worse can happen. Mm-hmm. So turning that criticism on myself, that is the sort of sentence that should really worry me. But man, in my bones, I really feel it.
No, I think I agree. I maybe not completely blow up, but just a place kids can go if they really want to learn literacy and numeracy. And that's it. Like that, I think would be preferable to what we have right now, and that is like, you know, almost nothing.
Yeah, I mean, It also doesn't succeed at getting most kids literate and numerate, right? I mean, You can define illiteracy in different ways, but however you define it, in the various different ways of defining it, like most kids can't read most things when they graduate high school,
which is crazy. All right, I wanted to go back to this thing about the kinds of understanding, which is a major theme both in the Post and, from what I can gather, in Egan's writings. The three major ones that people move through as they age are the mythic, romantic, and philosophic. Was that correct? I think we mostly talked about this in the last episode. I just want doing a quick refresher.
Yes.
Okay. One of the things that you said near the end here, which I don't remember if we got to, but I think if we did, we had to kind of skimp on it, was that the three modes of understanding want to destroy each other.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? Why do they want to destroy each other? What's going on here?
Okay, so one of the things of Egan. Oh, and by the way, it's pronounced Egan with the emphasis on the first syllable rather than Egan, which is the Ghostbuster, who is, you know, like
that's what I was going with.
Two of them, you know, that's one of his, I feel like this idea of his is both like the deepest genius of his, sorry, this is a fanboy speaking, like the deepest genius of his ideas, and also like the thing that has hamstrung his fans from properly communicating his ideas. Because it just sounds so, I don't know, mid-century intellectual or something, is that, do you guys know the phrase ontology recapitulates phylogeny?
Yes. That's
No.
Okay.
Go for it.
Let's explain it for people who don't know.
Take a crack at it. Or do you want to?
No, you go ahead, because you probably have this much more recently and well thought out than I could stumble through.
So there's this German biologist named Ernest Haeckel, I don't know, lived during the time of Darwin. And when Darwin's book came out, it changed his life. And he said, okay, like he was really into embryology, also starfishes, but also embryology. And he recognized, I'm putting that in like half scare quotes, that there's this weird thing that if you look at the embryos of different vertebrates at different stages in development, the quote-unquote more advanced ones, they will go through these stages where they look a heck of a lot like the ones that come their evolutionary ancestors.
Oh yeah, like human fetuses develop like a thin coat of hair that they then shed. Is that true?
Oh, I totally forgot about that. Yeah, that's true. Or at least I've heard that's true. Yeah. We have gill arches, like our jaws are actually like actually modified gill arches. Some other things too. So the weird thing is that like Haeckel is accused of, and I think probably guilty of, actually like fudging the data, where fudging the data actually means like slicing up dead embryos of animals to look like other animals, which is the ickiest possible thing. So like, I want to put like this in kind of some like, I haven't done my research to figure out like how much of these accusations are true or whatever, but there is definitely, some element where this is true. The discipline now is, EVO-DEVO, environmental, developmental biology, that kind of explores this. Anyway, Haeckel came up with this idea. Why are we talking about this? Haeckel came up with this phrase, this like famously mouthfully phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Ontogeny means the development of the organism, and phylogeny means its evolutionary ancestry. So every individual, as it develops, kind of goes through like these different stages or whatever of how its ancestors developed over long periods of time.
Like
so
first the embryo looks like a fish, and then it looks like an amphibian, and then it looks like a lizard, and then it looks like a monkey, and then it starts to look like a human kind of thing, right?
Yeah, thank you for being explicit about that. Yes, exactly.
And I have heard that is mostly wrong now, like not entirely wrong. Like you said, it's based on some real things, but not nearly to the level that he tried to make it out to be.
This feels like it's one of these science things for me that falls in this weird valley of some people, like there's probably something very true about it. Probably. Mm-hmm. This is not my field. I don't have a field. So this one is also not it. But also like its initial backers got way the heck too excited about it and went overboard with it. And then it became a meme for a long time of scientists dunking on this idea. But then they dunk on the strong claims, but then they mean that to discourage us from thinking about the weak claims. The triune brain theory is one of these things in that same category. Left versus right brains is something in this category for me. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. So ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Egan uses this phrase knowing like how packed it is, or how difficult or how weird it is, and how contentious. There's the phrase. Spicy, hot takey it is. And he says, okay, so there really is some sense in which as we become educated, what that means is we go through the sort of cognitive, he doesn't use the word stages of humanity as it developed, like modern philosophic, modern analytical thinking. And I think he's kind of right. I think he's definitely very right. And maybe he's even like profoundly right. What was the question again?
That the stages try to destroy each other.
Oh, yeah.
Why is that?
Okay, so taking like the simplified model of these stages, right, and just saying, okay, like imagine that there's mythic and there's philosophic. Mythic is like we use stories, we use metaphors, we use jokes, we use riddles, we use puzzles, we use games.
Binaries.
Sorry?
Binaries.
Oh, yeah. Binaries, to organize like all of our communication, all of our thinking. And then philosophic is like what happened in the scientific revolution? What happened in ancient Greece? What happened, I don't know, it's like the modern scientific, logical, rational thinking. Like the purpose that the people who invented modern thinking, philosophic thinking, like their goal was to say, hey, the old way is stupid. It kills people. It gets us to all sorts of ridiculous beliefs that are not true. It is like staying inside of the cave forever. We want to do away with those. And Egan points out that sure they can say that. Like this is exactly what Plato, was doing when he said we must ban the poets and the songwriters from society. In my ideal philosopher king ruled republic, not really republic, but and like they set themselves at war with destroying those old ways. They said those old ways were crap. But Egan says, yeah, but you can't get to there from here. You can't get to like philosophic without first amassing tons of understanding of the world using, the mythic ways of thinking, these preferred story-based ways of thinking. And so there's always this tension when we educate someone and we teach them the new ways, the philosophic ways, where we're implicitly saying that like the old ways are crap, they're childish, they're stupid. Don't use them. They won't give you a real view of reality. But we actually need those old ways to get kids to go where we want them to go.
Mm-hmm. So are you kind of saying like once you move on to from whatever binaries and metaphor and stories, moving more towards like meaning and certainty and stuff like that or nuance, like nuance and binaries don't, those are in inherent conflict, for example. Is that sort of the thing you're talking about?
Hold on. That nuance and conviction or nuance and certainty are in...
No, sorry, nuance and like binary thinking like kids have.
No, it's not. And that's really good. Thank you for that. No, because let me say why that's not what Egan means by this. And then I'll say what's closely related to it that is. Sometimes I see people's eyes go wide when I talk about like the importance of binary thinking. Oh gosh, just say that out loud right now in the current sort of social, political culture wars, right? Like it sounds like I'm saying something extraordinarily different than what I'm saying. People are worried about binaries. They say, but like reality is like this spectrum of things. And Egan's like, yes, absolutely. But like every story has a binary in it, and good stories are ones that can then complicate that binary. So even Stephen, the like having nuanced thinking that isn't between binaries, right? That like sort of destroys the binary, is something that little kids can understand. Like every good Pixar movie starts, I think we said this last time, like with a binary. And then by the end of it, like there is like this new transcendent way of like dealing with that issue. Did we talk about that last time?
I think we did, yeah. And Woody Toy Story being a great example.
And all that is my go-to example for that.
Yeah.
What's weird is that like there's in philosophic thinking, like that's actually when you get the people who are the most cocksure of themselves. There's real danger like in ideology when we get to like actually develop real philosophic thinking. Like kids become stupider for a while before they learn to transcend, they're like this one weird trick solves all problems in philosophy, all problems in politics, all problems in whatever, if they ever do transcend that. So I'd say that actually like the war against closed-mindedness is something that has to be fought again in every kind of understanding.
And at the end, I know we talked about this a lot last time, so I don't want to hit it too much, but as a quick refresher, the school of thought, which goes ultimately to take bits of all the different schools and integrate them and use them all together, is the ironic. Egan? No, Egan.
Yeah.
Egan calls it the ironic mode of thinking.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
Okay.
Terribly named, but yes.
Yeah. What would you name it?
I think there's a real question as to whether it is its own kind of understanding. Egan even says, right, like exactly like where one draws these lines, or like whether one is a splitter or a lumper, right? Like this is a choice of personal taste, and people can divide these up in different ways. But I think in some ways it's more helpful to see it as not a kind of understanding. It is just like, it is shrugging and stepping beyond these kinds of understanding, and saying that makes us open to using all of these kinds of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it is its own one in the same way that all of the other ones are.
Okay. We need to come up with some kind of good name for that, but we don't have one yet.
Post-rationality?
I mean, it was on the tip of my tongue, but I didn't want to say it yet, just because that term itself is kind of fraught.
I was really excited last time that you had made that connection to that. Yeah. Do you want to? Do you want to talk more about that?
Sure. I think I mentioned this before, but there's a type of post-rationality which feels like it is rejecting the philosophic and saying all this stuff that the rationalists thought was bad, and we need to go back to just the mythic, and maybe mythic with romantic mixed in. And they consider themselves post-rationalists, and like some of them were never even rationalists to begin with. But then there's a different kind of post-rationality, which to me feels like just the final stage of rationality, which is why I'm not sure if it should be called post or not, where it says the initial stage of rationality, the hardcore analytic, finding out all these things about the world, that is still good, and there's a lot of in value there, but it's not everything. And for a number of years, we made it our everything, and we learned and grew a lot during that. But we have to remember that there's a whole lot of other stuff that we temporarily left behind in the mythic and romantic stuff, which is just as important, especially for living as a human. And we need to reintegrate those as well, together with the things that we learned in the early rationality phase of our lives. And like, that is what I would consider post-rationalism, in the same way that like a post-grad is someone who has graduated and is doing more things with that. Whereas I think a lot of the people who, at least some of the people who use the term post-rationalist, mean it more in the way of the postmodern, where they have rejected the rationalist and moved to something different. And I don't think, that's why I don't necessarily like the term, because it means two different things, which in my opinion are radically different ways of dealing with the rationality thing once you have absorbed everything that you can from it.
Yeah, those
whether
are two,
it's an integration or a rejection.
Yeah, those are two very like heavy distinctions. And you're right; they're both reasonably called post-rationality. That's a branding problem, I think.
Isn't the same problem? Don't we have the same problem with the word rationalism or rationality? Where like it really like means to a lot of people, people who are wake up every morning and vow to be more like Spock than they were the day before.
Yeah.
And, also like kind of the opposite of that, right? Julia Galef pointing out that Spock is never right. Spock is almost never right when he gives the odds on something. And Spock is not actually being rational. He's being this, Gene Roddenberry's sort of hilarious commentary on nerds.
Yeah. I mean, I think the major thing is that all rationalists first go through their Spock phase at the beginning. Like maybe the first year, maybe only the first few months for some, maybe the first several years for others. But there is that point where you are like discovering the wonder and the beauty of being analytical and being right in these various ways that you can be right by applying numbers that you didn't know of before. And so you are in that phase for a while, but like eventually you move on past that and then integrate what you learned there. And a lot of people like to make fun of that Spock phase, but like it's a necessary thing to go through, just like the mythic binary, worshipping of heroes phase is important to go through. You can't get on to the next before going through that first one.
I think there's probably something to that. That definitely, at a quick glance of my autobiography, that scans.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's a point in everybody's life where their emotions just feel like the worst things in the world. They are harming them. You don't know what to deal with them. And a great way to put that on hold for a while is to just suppress them for a bit. And like, these emotions are stupid. They're ruining my life. If I can ignore them and not be motivated by them as much, my life will be better. And you can do that for a while and learn to to survive the onslaught of the emotions, and then later on start integrating the emotions and being informed by them without being overwhelmed by them. And I think specifically, I don't know about women, but I think specifically for young men who first get into the teenagehood, when just that mass tidal wave of testosterone hits you and everything seems so intense, I think that kind of is important just to deal with that, because otherwise you go around being a crazy man. What the heck? Sorry.
I teach adolescent young women also, and I'll say that there is some element of something like that for them as well.
Okay. I'm not surprised at all. I've heard teenagehood is terrible for everybody.
Puberty's hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think one is well advised at the onset to never go full Spock, you know?
I would agree. I think a lot of rationalists do. I think I did for at least a little while.
I think I probably wanted to, but was never smart enough to, so... or never smart enough to pretend to be full Spock, you know? Yeah. My memory's hazy, but yeah, I mean, how did this relate to what we were talking about? I lost the thread here for a second.
Well, let me bounce off of this then. I recognize that I feel like I may have had a different induction to the rationalist community because I came into it what feels like rather late, when I think I was more formed. Mm-hmm. And my intro was just Slate Star Codex and now Astro Codex 10, rather than any actual in-person meetup group, right? Like I go to meetup groups now, but I didn't then. If you guys had to like paint like a sketch of, I don't think one paints those, but paint a sketch of what an archetype of a person encountering the rationalist community, like what stages they go through, when do they pardon me, recovering from a flu, when do they find out about it, when do they, like, how do they react to it, like what does that look like?
Boy, I honestly, I would think it depends on what age they run into them. I ran into the rationalist community right as it was forming, but at that point I was already in my mid-20s, so I had already gone through my Spock phase, and I was still like in it, but I was at the very tail end of it, which kind of feels like perfect. It feels like Eliezer's early writings were absolutely, we are the super rationalist Spocky types, but we are now starting to understand that that's not enough. And so the early writings seem very much to fit into that Spock stereotype, but appealing to that person because they already exist and starting to move out of that. Like, you have to first appeal to the Spock to take them to the next stage. Whereas I think Slate Star Codex is already moved into the postgraduate, post-rationalist phase where everyone has assumed to already been moved past that stage by the time they're reading Slate Star Codex.
That's a fair point. I think also just because Slate Star Codex or ACX doesn't have the sequences. You know, it assumes a baseline. It's not there to teach you, here's the tools. It's like, all right, you know, I'm assuming y'all can follow this. Let's go ahead and work through this, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have 2 years worth of blog posts of foundation.
But I think nowadays, someone who is in their mid-teens who runs into Eliezer's writings for the first time is probably someone who is moving into the Spock phase or just near the early mid parts of it, and they will find a lot to relate to in that because it is, you know, aimed for specifically those sorts of people. And so you will still get a lot of people who in their first phase as a rationalist are going to be in that Spock phase, and I think that's fine. It's good to have something that appeals to people like that and that they can really see themselves in, and like it literally helps them be better at that and to start guiding them into the next stage. Gosh, that feels so condescending to say it from this point of view, like, oh yes, you are slowly coming up and becoming a better person, and I don't want to imply that.
I took it. I didn't take it condescendingly at all, and I think it matches up with my timeline rather well. Because I was trying to think of, you know, roughly my Spockiest years are probably, you know, after high school or something, maybe late high school, and then I came across this stuff in my whatever, as 19 or 20 or 21, and that was right around on time. And you're right, if I found it much earlier, I probably wouldn't have found it that interesting, and I have no idea who I'd have been if I found it 5 years later. But no, I don't think it's condescending at all. I mean, unless somebody's going to stand there and staunchly defend the like, no, let's be more Spockian. But I mean, even just looking at like what trends on Less Wrong now, like none of it is that direction. You know, a lot of it is like really compelling personal anecdotes and how I learned this lesson from this, and this might be generalizable kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
It's hardly like, here's another cognitive bias, it might draw from those, but it's not merely like an instructive thing that gives you another tool in your Spockian toolbox to feel more superior to other people.
Right.
That's fascinating. Thank you. No, that it helps me understand why when I've heard criticism of the community, it seems to describe parts of the community that I've never experienced, because maybe I missed the main part of the community. I missed the party in the late 2000s and just came in for the post-rationality part of it. But the good kind, not the bad kind.
To be fair, just to make sure, I've also heard criticisms of the community that seem not to apply to anyone at any time. So, I wouldn't, just to put that
like
in your, what was that?
Like what?
I've heard probably most egregiously, obviously false is that the rationalist community is transphobic, which I've heard defended staunchly, or rather argued staunchly, and they didn't seem moved at all by the fact that rationalists have a way above average base rate of trans people.
Yeah.
And it seems like if that wouldn't falsify the claim, then nothing possibly could.
Yeah.
But that sort of thing, I guess.
Yeah.
I have a question, a thing I wish to explore about the various schools of thought, since we are talking about those. There is this really fascinating, I want to call it assertion, but maybe observation in his works. I'm so stuck on the Ghostbusters thing because I watched so much of it. Egan, that the three basic kinds of understanding, mythic, romantic, and philosophic, are tied directly to how humans process words. That the mythic is born, well, let's take them one at a time, that the mythic is born of the time when humans discover speech, basically. The ability to talk with other humans and pool their brains and start commenting on things together.
And the first thing we do is start exaggerating and making stuff up. And then I fought this god the size of a mountain.
Mm-hmm. But that it seems to open up whole new vistas of the world, which now we need new ways of understanding the world to wrestle with once we can talk to other humans.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Yuval Harari talks about this in Sapiens, of how, we are the species that tell stories. We are the species that can lie. Then we can make up all sorts of things that aren't true, right? Stephen, to your point. We all know that real gods are not the size of mountains. But I thought that was funny.
It was. I just didn't want to interrupt. I was going to say, yeah, they're about 6'7", 6'8", right?
They're taller than normal people. We can be clear about this, right? We don't need to exaggerate beyond that. That's just silly.
Yeah. The tallest dude you've met plus 2 inches.
There you go.
That seems scary, right? There's a lot of extra leverage and a punch that somebody that big could have.
Just like the biggest fish I've ever caught is just this much bigger than the biggest fish you've ever caught.
Right.
Maybe this is like too obvious a point, but right, like before we had the ability to speak, we still had seemingly had complex societies. We had societies, right? We think that Australopithecus had social groups that were more complicated than your average chimpanzees, but not as much as your average hunter-gatherers now. And the ability to speak allowed information to be stored inside of the community. This is, I know that Ines, you'd wanted to talk about the work of Joe Henrich.
Yes.
Like, this is the guy who says, like, we are the cultural species. We survive not because we are so individually clever ourselves. There's actually an argument to be made that Neanderthals were more individually clever. But because we have these mental modules that allow us to tap into the deep history of our ancestors and to use their information. And then we get to become this, multi-tentacled beast where, when one person in a tribe fights another person, you actually have like the tribes fighting each other, right? It's like everything that this person has been able to tap into from their tribe versus everything in the other person's tribe, modulated by like how strong one person is or whatever. But to really see human history for what it's worth, you have to understand that we are not individuals, right? Haidt, Jonathan Haidt, right, says famously, we're 90% ape and 10% bee, I think is ants, I forget, right? We are these kind of hive creatures. And so verbal speaking allows us to do that. And certain kinds of understanding really are shaped by these special modules, these tools, stories, metaphors, binaries, etc., that we use. What was the question again? I should start writing the questions down. Is what I should start doing.
No, it's okay. I mean, it wasn't much of a question. It was much more of a comment that, like, unlocking the ability to have this collective memory through the speech with other humans is. That's why we need the mythic form of thinking of stories and metaphors and binaries, because it helps that stick and become transmitted more correctly from person to person.
Well, and one interesting thing about it is that every mode of communication, right? Who said this? Marshall McLuhan, has its own flavor. Mm-hmm. Speech has this like warm, it sounds stupid maybe to say it's flavor, but like speech is warm. Speech is easy to communicate emotion, right? Speech is easy to communicate emotion, right? What? Obviously, those are two totally different meanings that are, I'm recognizing right now that was an ungrammatical sentence. But
hey, that's a romantic concern, sir.
Nerd. But there's so much information that is transmitted just through like how one's body is and how one's tone is with all of that. There's beat, there's rhythm, there's rhyme, there's all of these things that are not obvious when something is in print. Print, not even necessarily print, but like handwriting too, right? Any kind of writing like has its own advantages. Most obviously, it can last forever. Yeah. Or it can last for hundreds or thousands of years.
And it can transmit information when there's no other human around to transmit it.
If you imagine, like if you invert the whole story and you don't imagine that it's humans who are having ideas who are talking to other humans, but it's ideas who are jumping through human brains to get out into the world and back into other human brains again, right? A human brain is the natural habitat of every idea. Then like writing is the greatest thing that has ever happened.
Yeah. Writing was a great fitness jump for memetics, right? For memetic transmission. Oh, great. The meat suit that I'm being, carried around, it doesn't have to survive and talk this through. It can just write it down and I'll get all over the place.
I've heard it said, and I strongly believe this, is that writing is the first thing that made humans into cyborgs. That once we had writing, we are now not just ourselves, we are ourselves plus our tools. Because like as you said, not only does it free up working memory, but the ideas that we have become objects of contemplation in their own right. Yeah.
I mean, there's your extra RAM, right? We make a big deal about how the long-term memory cyborg add-on effect that writing gives us. But I think less appreciated is the working memory add-on, right? Like my brain can hold, 3 or 4 different bits of information if those studies are to be believed, and they are. But if I write things down, then I can just stare at the page and now I have my 3 or 4, bits of working memory are now cleared. And I can consider at almost the same time all of the things that are on the piece of paper that's right in front of me. And I can combine them together in new ways. Mm-hmm. This is why, having a flipping commonplace book is such a useful tool. Or when you sit down to work on a hard project that you feel stressed about, just like this is very David Allen in getting things done, right? Like just spending 5 minutes and vomiting out all of the things that are in your mind at that moment is so wonderful, because now you're not carrying it, right? Your mind is for having ideas, not for holding them, I think is David Allen's way of
That's a nice way to put it.
Yeah. But the downside is that there's no tone in physical writing. I mean, you can use boldface or italics, and these are actually like tools norms that we've cobbled together, right? Like if I underline something, if I put asterisks around it, right? Like then it is meant to be interpreted as this tone. But like, my goodness, like italics can mean like 1,000 different things. Yeah. Subtle differences in how I say a sentence, right? Can be like, can communicate something as broad as things as different as "thank you so much for saying this" or "you're an idiot."
Right. It's like if you say, I have lost confidence in your willingness to speak candidly to the board, like in one context, that means very little. In corporate speak, that means you just shot someone in the face. Yeah.
When you said that you think that I write the way that I talk. I've heard that a couple times before, so I believe it. Mm-hmm. What am I doing?
You convey enthusiasm.
You convey enthusiasm.
You'll have to lean on our writer to explain exactly how you're doing that.
Well, so I know this is not literally true that you just write what you are thinking, because there's no way someone just writing what they're thinking could write anything this good. When I wrote the real fanfic is The Friends We Found Along the Way, or it's a so much more fun way of writing, but there is a style of writing that is the default, where it is a bit reserved and you don't speak directly to the listener. You are putting thoughts forward with the understanding that someday some impartial observer will observe them. Whereas if you are trying to take a more I have to call it fanficky, because I first saw it, and I see it the most in fanfic style writings. You are engaging with the reader directly as if they are a peer, and you are having fun with them, and you expect them to understand some of your references, and you're happy to joke around. And that is that takes a different type of work, and that is the thing you're doing, where it feels much more relatable, where you're a warm human who is having fun, and you are treating me also as someone you personally know and expect to relate to you on a deeper level than just an impartial observer who found this text.
I'd also add that there's the component of it feels like a conversation when you pause to do Q&As. And it's like, oh, I bet you're thinking this. And it's like, oh, I was thinking that. Thank you for addressing this. And I find those really helpful.
That's something that I actually, Egan never says that, but I got it from Egan. That right, like if it's true that minds are really built for dialogue. I mean, if they're really built for speech, then they're built for dialogue, because nobody ever gives a 11-hour long speech that they expect other people to follow.
Unless you're Ayn Rand.
I just, started a new book about the Renaissance and Reformation yesterday, and I'm excited about it. But the author, I like his points, and he's challenging me in a bunch of my assumptions about the early modern period. But he's not the greatest writer. I don't mean that to mean that he's crap, but he's not the greatest writer, and it shows. And it's just a bunch of like, here is this sort of like information, and it's kind of dead, and you have to like work to really kind of get excited about it. And anyway, it's 11 hours long, is where I was thinking about with that. But like, if we're built for speech, then we're built for dialogue, which means that maybe even more than storytelling, what like good writing of a certain sort, because you can't do this in everything, but like, no, that a cheap hack to use when trying to get people to understand something is to do it in, if not straight up dialogue the entire time, right? Like Scott Alexander is so good at that. I'm not. But to have occasional, like, interlocutors, is the trick that I use with my Substack, my imaginary interlocutor who just jumps in and asks typically quasi-rude questions. And then directly responding to those is just, it's cheap. It's cheap and it works and it's easy, and I recommend that everybody does it.
Yeah. Well, I think I've definitely heard that advice when communicating, people, when science was communicated to people writing their own books rather than publishing to journals. A good example would be like Darwin saying, how does evolution explain the evolution of an eye, right? Yeah. Or the development of an eye over time. And if you stop reading there, it sounds like he's giving up. But if you don't, he goes on to explain, oh, well, it would, maybe kind of like this. And, good persuasive writing involves, and maybe this is the jump, actually. It's not just persuasive writing. Good informative writing involves anticipating where people might be disagreeing with where you are so that you can keep going. Because if they jump off, a third of the way through because you're not addressing their concerns, then they're not going to finish, right? But if you say, I think I was where you are. Let me explain why I'm not stuck on that point. And then they can keep going, right?
Do you guys know where that chapter came from in Origin of Species?
No.
There is one of my favorite scientists, He's a guy named Saint George. No, wait. Yeah, Saint George. No, I'm getting the order of his 12 names wrong. Saint George Jackson Mivart, contemporary of Darwin. He was an early convert to Darwinism, and then he had a change of heart and converted against it, and converted. I've maybe just kind of reconverted to the traditionalist Catholicism of his youth. Wrote a bunch of really interesting controversial theology, and at the end of his days was denied being buried, the ability to be buried in a Catholic cemetery. Also, probably the seminaries wouldn't take him. But he challenged Darwin and said, look, what about the eye? What about feathers? What about these ridiculously complex features that seem like, what good is it to have half of a feather? What good is it to have half of an eye? And Darwin did not have that chapter in the first or maybe even the second edition of On the Origin. And it was through these letters with Mivart that he was challenged on this. And Mivart was a really helpful adversary, who really, tried to crucify Darwin on not being able to explain this. And then Darwin had to come up with some explanations, and his explanations are actually really good explanations, it turns out. And, obviously it's like when young earth creationists will cite, the first lines of that chapter, they'll cite the part that says if I cannot explain the eye, then my idea has a terrible, terrible problem. And they ignore the fact that is the first paragraph of his chapter.
Yeah.
But it goes to the idea that
the timeless art of quote mining.
Yeah.
I used
So
to be
you said
really into the yeah.
You said in one of your blog posts that the secret sauce of the scientific revolution were new rules for arguing that made it possible to stay in conversation with one's frenemies forever. And just before that, you had argued that the scientific method is not a new thing and not what created the Enlightenment, because people knew about observing the world and then doing some things to it to see what changes for hundreds, if not thousands of years before that. So what is the thing that made the scientific revolution possible, these new rules for arguing?
Well, we need to be clear as to what we mean by the scientific revolution, because I've been reading a lot of books on the scientific method and the history of the scientific method. And one of them, Carlo Rovelli's book on Anaximander, just so flipping amazing. One of those books, you read it and you're like, yeah, you get it from the library, I think this will be good. Maybe I should buy this. And then you buy it and you start at the beginning and you actually start to read it through and you're like, oh my God, this is, oh wow, this takes everything that I knew, but it elevates it to 11. It's so clear, and now I understand everything. And then you go back through it and you begin to summarize every section in a sentence at the top of the page. You're like, oh my gosh, I could actually ape this. This is going to change my life. And then you realize that you forgot to finish the book in the first place, and you have 3 more chapters. It's yes, Merry Christmas, Carlo Rovelli. Mm-hmm. This might be the first time that's actually ever happened to me. This is probably not a universal human experience. But he points out in this book that you can say that science begins at Newton, and that's a significant sentence that means something. You could say it begins at Galileo, and that's actually there's another bookend you could have there. If you define science as a slightly different thing, you could say that it begins at Anaximander in ancient Greece. You could say that it begins with the first hominids, who had a frontal lobe or something like that, right? So when you say this, Eneasz, do you mean you're asking the question, how did we get the quote unquote scientific revolution, the capital S, capital R scientific revolution that happened in the 1700s?
The quote that I'm looking at has the capital S and the capital R. So let's go with yes.
We'll take it. Okay. So, people we'll take a piss on alchemy, but those alchemists, they actually understood so many details.
Was that a joke because urine was a huge thing in alchemy?
And if you believe that, I have some phosphorus to sell you. See, then there's the problem where I say a joke, and thank you for laughing that time. That was very nice, but I'm that was a bad joke, and now I'm just very distracted by that. No, not intended to be a joke there. Although one of you had mentioned earlier about either Uranus or Uranus. The beautiful thing with those pronunciations is that they're both potty humor, or at least the potential for potty humor, is pregnant in both of those. And it's even better because the planet itself probably smells like pee. So the details that you learn when you're putting together a lesson, right? But capital S, capital R, scientific revolution, the alchemists, like it's not like people woke up in the 1600s and said, hey, we should, learn about the natural world. Like they'd been working at it for thousands of years. They had been coming up with all of these different theories. The theories, were mostly bunk. But they knew their details so well, and they had their lab methods like so well done. All those ended up being necessary. But the problem with the ways that they were doing science is there's a couple of problems. And everything that I'm getting right now is a terrible summation of Michael Streven's book, The Knowledge Machine, how science became modern, or how we got to modern science, or subtitled something like that. And he says that, well, one, like they were keeping their stuff secret, right? Like if you discovered some step toward the Philosopher's Stone, you didn't want your enemies to know how to make the Philosopher's Stone or get that much closer to making it or whatever. That's a bad example. But another piece of it is that they didn't have, because they were working in different paradigms, they didn't have a way of challenging one another. Because, a challenge in one paradigm wouldn't make any sense in another paradigm. This is the problem that happened in ancient Greece between like the atomists and the anti-atomists. I forget the phrase for that. And between the Aristotelians and the Epicureans and the Stoics and whatever. They didn't have a way of challenging one another. And so in the 1600s, in the definitely autistic person of Isaac Newton, you have this brilliant mind who's connecting the cosmos together, but he's doing it through math. And when asked, okay, like, what is this gravity that you have invented? What is actually causing these patterns that you have titled gravity? He says, I do not feign hypotheses. He says, maybe it's some sort of mechanical, maybe some sort of mechanism. Maybe it is ghosts. Maybe it is like something like occultic. I think he actually uses like whatever the word occultic is in Latin. I might be wrong about that and probably has different connotations, but maybe it's something like spooky like that. Maybe it's just God. I have no idea. I'm not interested in the depths of things. I'm just interested in explaining the patterns that we see around us and being able to predict what will happen if we see, this certain confluence of events, whether we make those in a lab or whether, we just like come across some sort of natural experiment. I'm just interested in the numbers, right? I'm interested in measuring these things and arguing through math. And Newton like had his own personal, wonky, bizarre beliefs, right? This is a person who spent more than half of his time on a combination of trying to literally create the Philosopher's Stone and trying to predict exactly when the return of Christ will be. Got really into the details of the building specifications for Solomon's temple, because he thought that had, messianic eschatological importance. So he had his wonky beliefs, but he walled them off from his public science communication. And so it was that kind of, hey, now we have a way of fighting each other, of challenging each other through predictions, through measurable predictions or predictions of measurable quantities that allowed the science to actually to enter into its full philosophic phase. Egan would probably,
I love that you brought it back to that, because I was going to tie it back to the kinds of understanding and the technologies for communication, because like the mythic as was spawned from the ability from people to talk to each other, then the romantic came from, you said the Greek miracle is explained in large part by the Greeks were the first people who take the tool of writing and actually just exploit it to its fullest extent and get this insane explosion of knowledge and new ways of being a human and being a thinking being, which is captured in the romantic kind of understanding. And then the philosophic is specifically when this more analytical, math-based type of writing is introduced, and that creates another whole new way for people to think. And so these three types of thinking are the recapitulation of the three ways that humans have discovered to communicate with each other through using technology. Assuming we consider speech to be a technology.
Yeah, that was really well said. And so I'm kind of excited about this because I have a bone to pick with the two of you. I was listening to one of your podcasts from, I don't know, like 2 years ago, a couple of days ago. I'm like, wait, I think that's a terrible thing to say. But it relates to this. It relates specifically to where philosophic thinking came from and how we can cultivate it in ourselves and in kids today. But let me start by dissing something that Egan said, which I was in what you were just saying, which is I was representing what Egan said in that. So Carlo Rovelli writes this book this year on Anaximander and talks about specifically not even like ancient Greece, but like this specific island called Miletus, which is off the coast of Turkey, which is part of the Greek world at the time. That this is where Thales comes from. This is where his student Anaximander comes from. This is where Anaximander's probable student Pythagoras definitely comes from. Or somewhere really close to that. I suddenly realized that I'm not totally clear that they're all from exactly that one island, but whatever, the close area. Egan focuses on the writing technology. And I think that actually misses the bigger picture of what's going on. Although I do think he's totally right that the writing technology is very, very important. But like Carlo Rovelli asks, why Greece, but then also like why Asia Minor, these islands, this part of Turkey, and then why specifically this one random island of Miletus. Oh gosh, now I'm even thinking like, wait, am I positive it's an island? I was just looking this on a map a couple days ago on Google Maps. Maybe I'm wrong about this. Okay, this one area called Miletus, and he points out
it was an island of knowledge.
Thank you so much. Yes, let's use
metaphor.
Quite the high and lofty crags. It's tectonic plates. Okay, maybe I'm pushing that too far. He says, look, like this is the part of the world that is most in communication with like the most number of other parts of the world. They had like 800 years 600, 400 years earlier, like they'd had this like massive palace-based civilization. It had mysteriously crashed and burned. They were in this dark ages for like at least 400 years. And then they began to pick themselves up, but they were a trading society. They were a rich city of traders. They did not have a king anymore. So they had to be this like quasi-democratic. Democratic here means like being run by the rich merchant families, probably, right? Not really democratic exactly, but like it wasn't like a kingly court, a royal court that was going on, which is like how like Assyrian knowledge and Babylonian knowledge and Sumerian knowledge and Egyptian knowledge, like that was basically just like the court knowledge. Like everybody else was just toiling in the fields or whatever. The salt mines. But like in this city, you had a whole bunch of people just kind of like working together to run the city and to chart the city's own destiny. They traded with Egypt. They traded with like Germanic cities in the north side of the Black Sea. They traded with Assyria. They traded, like they settled colonies in Spain, right? Like these were people who went around to all of these different cultures. And they had, their own Greek myths, like they read the Odyssey or they listened to the Odyssey and the Iliad and all that. They had these myths. They had their own like understanding of like, here's where the world is. Here's what the world is. And Herodotus tells the story of one of the Milesians, I think, going from Miletus to one of the cities in ancient Egypt and talking to a priest there. And the guy boasted like I am the 17th descendant from one of our gods, right? Like, who created humans like when the world was young, because ancient Greeks like thought that the world was only like no more than 20 generations old. And the Egyptian priest like nods and says, yes, let me show you this. And he walks into the temple and he says like, I am like the head, I'm a priest. We have a head priest. Before him, his father was the head priest. Before him, his father was the head priest. And every one of them makes a statue of himself and puts it in this line. And let me walk you through the line of head priests. And he walks them through, 20, 100, 200, 300, 345 statues in a row. And this like Greek would-be philosopher's mind is just flipping blown, right? Like all of everything that I thought about the world, like my basic understandings of the world cannot possibly be true.
Or this guy's making up some stuff with his statues, but
sorry, say that again.
Or this guy's inventing some extra statues, but
that's good skepticism. That's good rationalist thinking. That's good rationalist thinking. Perhaps the world only is 20 generations old.
Being open to this new line of compelling evidence is also good rationalist thinking. So
yeah,
and in fact, like maybe like some historians have pointed to this as like the beginning of rationalist thinking. Like it's the destruction of your own like cherished beliefs. Eneash, before when you said like these kinds of understanding are at war with one another, right? I think I focused on maybe the stupidest part of that. I said like, well, like the kind of understanding that was like generated by mythic thinking, like is the sort of thing that like Plato is against because it's stupid. But also like we can say that, yeah, like it's like the specific things that the specific beliefs that do get generated by mythic thinking. You have to have this disillusionment. Maybe have is way too strong of a word there. Like maybe to become a rationalist, it helps to be monstrously disillusioned, to have like your well-built ship of thought crash on the shoals and to have everyone on board die and have you like some ways the lone survivor. Maybe that helps. How often do you guys see that in the rationalist community?
In my experience, at least half the people.
Yeah, a lot of them go through some sort of, like I said, foundational sundering of everything they thought was true. And they're like, okay, forget it. Let's start from scratch.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have exact numbers, but just based on the people that I talk to and learn about their past, half would be within a good bound, I think.
Okay. That's definitely going to be above the base rate of humans. It's definitely going to be above the base rate of modern humans. I'm wondering how it compares to other communities, right? Like the atheist community. I used to be really active in the atheist community. It's probably about this. I'm wondering if it's the same as that or not. Yeah.
I don't think it's any coincidence that the rationalism thing was huge. Like not into, but like co-evolved and with the tail end of the new atheism thing that a lot of people, there was a lot of overlap between the two.
Well, and that loss of everything I believe is or that realization that everything I believe is false. I think the classic example is like, I thought the universe was designed by a God who loved me, and now I don't think so.
Yes.
Where else do you guys see though, like when people come into the rationalist community and they've gone through these crises, what are they when they're not religious?
So surprisingly, this is a thing that has happened to me twice. Once when I left religion and was like, oh my God, everyone has been lying to me my entire life about this God person existing and what that means for the universe. The second one has been much more recent where I was like, oh my God, everyone has been lying to me about there being no difference between the sexes and what this means to the universe. Because I was deeply raised in the leftist, tabula rasa sort of idea that there really is no difference among humans. All humans are basically the same at birth, with the exception that at puberty, males get some more upper body strength. But like just the extent to how much I was wrong about things, I was shocked to discover a number of years ago that men and women literally have different skin, that it's just thicker and deeper for men. And that
really?
And and I was listening to NPR during the World Cup. There was a big scandal, I don't know, 5-6 years ago when it was publicized that the Women's World Cup winners got paid so much less than the Men's World Cup. And I was listening to some interview between two people talking on NPR, and someone said, look, someone could just say, why don't the Men's World Cup winners play the Women's World Cup winners to resolve the situation that way? And like literally, that is a thought I had. I was like, yeah, I mean, we should do that, right? That would just work. And the very next sentence was, but of course, anyone who said that is obviously arguing in bad faith, and no good, right-thinking human would ever say such a thing. Not the exact words, but something along those lines. And like, again, my mind was blown. I was like, what? First of all, I think that's a great idea. Are you telling me there's difference in soccer ability in a sport that doesn't use any upper body strength between the sexes? Why? And how is it that everybody except me knows this to the point where it would be considered politically suicide to say that if you're on the left? Like, it is literally a thing I believe. And yeah, then I discovered that actually there is a great deal of other differences between men and women, and all that went into other things that people want out of their lives and need. And I don't know, it spiraled greatly from there. And, you know, I'm not like some weird right-wing red pillar kind of person, but the fact that there are major differences between these two halves of humanity has been legit shocking to me. And I was like, oh my God, like my parents, the older generations, they knew this. And they hid it because, you know, for the greater good, we want to treat everybody as if they're equal. So we're going to say that because it's just a polite lie. We all know it's not true. But then the next generation up, me, came up, you know, not getting the joke, as they call it. I did not know that this was a thing we say because it's polite and it's how we want to treat people. I thought it was literally true. And that had drastic impacts to my life.
Yeah, I think more generally, I think another avenue might just be coming from realizing that some foundational culture thing that you believed was misrepresented to you or was outright wrong, right? So, I mean, it's not entirely dissimilar to religious disillusionment.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, just the whole
politics,
everyone
thing.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose so. Anything that would be, you know, important to you that you believe this, you know, not necessarily because it's true, but because it's important for other reasons. You know, like everyone in my community believes this. You know, I think I probably had something like that in my. It would have been ages ago, but with the wage gap thing. You know, I'd always been told that, you know, women are paid 74 cents on the dollar compared to what men make, and someone had just said, like, why wouldn't Walmart hire all women then to save 25% on labor costs? And I'm just like, shoot, that's a really good point. It can't be that cut and dry. Otherwise, every Walmart, every drive-through would be all women if they were really just allowed to pay them, 25 cents less on the dollar. So it, you know, I don't know if that would be enough to count as like I guess that's a small example. I don't know if that'd be quite the foundational shaking, but it is the sort of thing of like, well, all my peers believe this thing. It's a big talking point amongst, you know, my political allies. You know, and then for me to be like, oh, well, I guess I'm going against the grain now. I don't know if that is exactly
absolutely
analogous, but
I used to teach a moral economics class, and we did a whole, you know, week or something of arguing about the pay gap. And I remember the feeling of anger that some of the members of the class showed when they found out that where that number, right, which is computed differently for different years, right? I've heard 88, whatever. Where that number refers to not what they think it refers to. They think that it means that two people a man and a woman having exactly the same job, one of them is paid so much less, when actually where that number, how it's measured is if you just take women of a certain age and men of a certain age who are in the workforce, and don't look at the differences they have in jobs and careers and whatever, then that is the difference, which does not mean that number is stupid. It's still a very important number. It just means totally a different thing than what they thought it meant. And they were furious when they found that out.
Yeah. To be clear, I don't deny that there's a pay difference. It's just that, you know, like it was a talking point of, you know, Hillary Clinton's platform, you know, the 74 cents or 78 cents, whatever the number was back then.
Oh, wow.
And it felt so disingenuous. And it's like, can we not just be honest that we're talking about lifetime earnings and, you know, that women get this huge, or, you know, historically and commonly get this huge career setback when they take 10, 15 years off to raise children. And then they start again, you know, from, without so let's say, you know, you grab a bunch of men and women in their 50s, well, or, you know, maybe, late 50s, and look at what they're earning, and the men are earning more. Well, there's our unfairness. It's like, yeah, but half this group took 15 years off and thus didn't get to keep climbing the ladder all that time, right?
I think
when I say took 15 years off, I don't mean that, as a vacation. I meant to rear children.
Yeah.
No judgment here, no judgment.
I think part of the drive to rationalism for a lot of people who have had this experience is it's the experience of feeling betrayed, of having been lied to about something that you just trusted, the people that told you these things, and then you discover you cannot trust them. And now what are you left with? If you can't trust the people that tell you things, I guess you either give up and be helpless, or you start trying to figure things out yourself. And that's when you need things like the tools of rationality to be like, all right, I guess I'm starting from almost nothing. How do I figure this stuff out myself? And I think that's a driving force for a lot of them.
I was talking to a very, very smart evangelical Christian friend of mine a couple of weeks ago, and I do an interreligious conversation group, and he was asking those of us who were some variant of agnostic or atheist or whatever, like, how do you build a worldview? like it seems really hard. And we're like, yes and no. He's like, but like, how would you even find out what you could trust? Like my view of science, like the faith that I place in scientists has gone down substantially in the last 5-10 years.
Yeah.
It just seems like a lot of what they swear up and down is true is very tenuous. And I don't know how to suss out the good from the bad. And I realized, oh man, you're being very wise. If you don't know how to do that, you're stupid if you try to build a worldview. You're totally gonna get it wrong. Not to say that I've gotten it all right, but I've gotten it right because I keep getting it wrong and I keep being betrayed. And I haven't been so very betrayed in a while, I'm hopeful that maybe I have some great mind change left in me where I've realized I've been totally lied to and I can break out of, because that is such a terrifying and exciting experience. I'm hopeful.
I think the goal is to be less wrong over time.
Hey, that's the name of the show.
That's the name of the thing. I'm curious, before we drop the thread on it, the beef that you had with a couple-year-old podcast, and I need to start by saying that I don't stand by anything I said 2 years ago. However, let's see if I still agree with this.
2 years ago, me was an idiot.
There was a conversation that you guys are having about... I forget what the major conversation was, but the rabbit trail, the really enjoyable rabbit trail was... Can you separate the art from the artist? And the topic of J.K. Rowling came up, and let me just, because the trans issue is so hot, let me just not touch that one at all, and let me go to the much easier one for our community and say, you guys brought up Orson Scott Card, and I can't remember if it was one of you, both of you, the third person who you have on, whose name I'm terrifyingly forgotten right now. I'm so sorry.
Jace.
I'm so sorry.
If it was 2 years ago, it would have been Jace.
Okay, that's right. That's right, Jace. So I can't remember who it was who said it, but there was definitely some expression of, if I had known, I'm glad that I read Ender's Game before I knew that he was a Mormon, because I might not have read it otherwise.
Huh.
And maybe I've just missed the subtext where it was just assumed that is a bad human failing. But that's a bad human failing. And I feel like for me, one of the things, one of the core parts of myself is a rationalist, right? Insofar as I call myself that, which I really do call myself a rationalist, is this striving to get over the feeling of ickiness that I have with people that I really disagree with. And I think that is so essential, pedagogically, but to personally advance, because of everything that we've been talking about, because of, it's not that in Miletus you had access to some civilization who had it all figured out. You just had access to some other civilization that was hilariously wrong in their own different way. And the, in the scientific revolution, they found a way of just, first of all, debating forever even with ideas that they thought were wrong, and not just like splitting off and becoming their own like ideologically pure community, but also they had this division between what one's private beliefs were, which in the case of most of the early modern scientists were insane. And were insane for the time too. You had the division between like what they were going to publicly put up for argument and what their own beliefs were. And we find that actually like there seems, hold on. I'm actually getting the name of this book right now. Here it is. Michael Streven's book, The Knowledge Machine. The subtitle is How Irrationality Created Modern Science. There we go. Because like it seems that like so many of our best scientific ideas came from the stupidest, wrongest possible contexts. And he actually worries, the author worries that because we value being authentic now more than they did at the time, this was a time that was steeped in religious persecution where everybody who had interesting religious beliefs kept their religious beliefs to their own flipping selves. They were used to having wonky ideas and hiding them. We don't do that now, where we don't incentivize that. And so the author actually worries that we're actually going to have less breakthroughs in science and everything because of that. So sorry, that's it. That's what I got. How do you guys want to respond to any of that?
I like that you don't remember who said what, so I don't have to pick to decide if I agree with that sentence or not. Like for current me, it's less about. I think if it was I didn't know. I didn't know Orson Scott Card was a Mormon, so then I don't think I was the one who said that. But I do know that apparently he was staunchly homophobic or something. And I don't think that would have diminished. I mean, it might have. I don't know if that. Would that have made me less likely to pick up Ender's Game? I don't know. Maybe just on default. Like if I don't know. I'm disinclined to read Jordan Peterson's writings, even on the stuff that he's apparently good at writing about, because I was exposed to him first as a nut job, and so. I'm given to understand he has some useful things to say, but it's like, I feel like I'm going to have to weed through this nonsense. And then I'm going to have in the back of my mind, oh yeah, this guy's kind of gone off the edge of Looneyville. So, I mean, there's something just about screening for time, where I'll prioritize what I want to watch. It's kind of like, I love this director and they just put out a new thing. I'm going to watch their new thing, so it's like, going with what I think I'll like already. But as far as like differentiating art from artist, I think that Orson Scott Card is brought up because like I read Ender's Game before I knew anything about the author. And the thing is, I could never learn anything about him and still love the book. Right.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, the art is extremely distant from the artist. His name not even need to be on the book cover and I can still enjoy the story. I don't need to know a thing about the person who invented it. So I think that's my current take.
I mean, I basically agree. I don't think that. So I don't think that having the knowledge of an author should impact a book at all. It can, because sometimes having a historical context of what's going on and what the author is responding to can inform what you're reading and make it more interesting. But as Stephen said, I think a good piece of art, you could have no idea who the author is at all, and it's still a good piece of art, and that is what everybody thinks should aspire to. So, specifically knowing someone is a Mormon would not make me less inclined to read their book. And in fact, due to what I know about Mormons and founder effects, it might make me think that the book is better than average, because Mormons kind of got a subspeciality in writing science fiction now, due to founder effects and how much it's a focus of their Mormon universities. It's really interesting, and they generally keep their religion out of their writing because they know it's not popular. I don't know. The thing is, like, other things do. Okay, so as a personal example, for our next book club book, there is a book.
You guys have a book club?
I am in a book club in Denver, yes. We meet usually twice a month to discuss science fiction and fantasy.
Okay.
The next book that we picked, I was looking, to buy it on Amazon, and I saw at the top that it is a Nebula Award nominee, which is one of the two big science fiction awards, and is recommended by NPR. And I told the rest of my book club I am going to skip this meeting because to me, that is literally a disendorsement. If I see that these people liked it, that means I'm probably not going to like it. And that's not necessarily saying anything bad about the book. It says that like tastes differ. Like if somebody recommends a piece of music to me and I see that it won a country music award, I know I'm probably not going to like it because I don't really like country. And I have nothing against country or the people who like country. I'm sure it's an amazing country song. It's just not something I'm going to enjoy. And so sometimes you can get information about whether you'll like something or not like that. So if you're someone who has discovered that writings by Mormon science fiction authors are usually kind of not to your taste, then I can understand that. But I don't think just the fact that a person has a set of beliefs which conflict with your beliefs should ever be a reason to not read something. Because some of the best books I've ever read have been written by people who I strongly disagree with in other aspects of life.
And just to give you one more thing before to stack on for you to reply to is on the flip side of that, sometimes knowing about the author can really enhance the enjoyment of it. You know, reading Unweaving the Rainbow, for example, by Richard Dawkins. You know, he doesn't take a lot of swings at religion in it. In fact, I think I think he wrote this well before the God Delusion. But knowing how he feels about that, you can kind of sense the undercurrent, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I see what you're trying not to say here. Or reading, you know, What Lies Dreaming, and if I know Eneasz personally, I can just, you know, insert a lot of, you know, I can psychoanalyze the author on a whole other level, right? Or I don't know, reading Contact. Or here's a good example. You know, this just because it's a fun. Oh no, yeah. You know, reading Contact by Carl Sagan. You know, knowing that he's a scientist helps. Mm-hmm. You know, reading The Martian by Andy Weir, knowing that he's not exactly a scientist, but he wrote it trying to get as much of the science as possible correct, in no small part because he didn't want Neil deGrasse Tyson ripping it apart. Helps enjoy it because you're like, oh, okay. So when I can kind of put more trust in the numbers here because I can tell, because I know that he was trying to get this correct, not just like having fun telling a story.
Wait, what's the connection to Neil deGrasse Tyson?
Way back, I'm sure maybe this podcast is still on, but way back in the day, this would have been 15 years ago. That's my benchmark for how long ago everything was. He was on Neil deGrasse Tyson's Star Talk Radio, and Tyson said, you know, the book did a really good job getting a lot of the science right. And he says, thanks, I did that with you ripping it apart in mind. Because Tyson, you know, would love to go to Twitter and be like, oh, well, you know, this makes no sense because of how big this thing is or whatever, right?
I remember when he came on The Daily Show and he told Jon Stewart, you know, your Earth in the intro is rotating backwards.
My son is going through Hail Mary for, I think, the third time right now. We're big Andy Weir fans in my family, in my household. Okay, so what I hear you both saying, I'm in general agreement with what you're all saying. One of the things that I'm hearing you say is that having this information is relevant. We should not just try to totally ignore. It's counterproductive in many situations to totally ignore the identity, beliefs, choices, actions of the author.
That's not quite what I'm saying. I'm saying because in one hand I'm saying that it can enhance stuff, but it's by no means necessary. You know, if I got the Harry Potter book series with no author on the front of it, I would have loved it as a kid, you know, and I'd probably still like it now. It's a fun, gripping story, you know, and especially for the age that I read it at, I was at Harry's age for most of the time I was reading these books, you know, so like as the books got more mature, so did I, etc. You know, so like, anyway, so yeah, I think I guess I'm taking this awesome stance where I get to play both sides, where knowing the author helps and it shouldn't help or doing it hurt at all. So.
I mean, you know, in literary theory, right, there's the whole like death of the author movement that said like we shouldn't think that the author is even an entity in this. And then there's the whole like let's explain the book that we're talking about by looking at the author's biography and making everything connected to that. And both of there's wisdom in both of those. So then let me fine tune that by saying that the thing that I definitely agree with you about is that knowing the author can be good information, can be helpful information. And yeah, I guess I also agree that it's not necessary in many situations. Maybe, yeah. The part that maybe there's still a difference between us in is that I feel like it's a really important thing to try, once we recognize that we have this cognitive bias of thinking that the other side is icky, of going out of our way or of trying to as much as we can. And I suck at this, and I think I'm still better than most people are at this because it's so painful. Of actually like presenting ourselves with good art and good arguments and good relationships from the other side, right? Like if I found out that somebody was, I don't know, like when I find out that somebody has politics that I really disagree with, but has a novel out that I might love, I get really excited. Or I determine that I'll never read it because they're human garbage and I should break into the bookstore and set all their books on fire, right? Like I have complicated feelings, but I feel like we should try to push ourselves into more of this thing. Is there any disagreement between us on this?
This reminds me of you asked for like moments of like, foundational awakenings where it's like, oh, what everything I believe is wrong. This does tie in where, like the first time reading Peter Singer, I was like in my early 20s. And, first exposed to the best arguments for utilitarian thinking. I imagine I'm not the only person that found that like compelling and kind of world view shattering. And those people probably find their way into the EA circles, which find their way, that Venn diagram overlapping with the rationalist circles. So that's probably another avenue. My only argument would be like the amount of time that I have. Well, and, if I've read their other stuff before, like if it just turns out, like the country music example Enosh gave, like if it's unlikely I'll like this next country music song because I hated again, nothing personal, but I just didn't like the first 100 I heard, so there's something about that. But I do like engaging with arguments to disagree with when they're well presented. For sure.
I very strongly agree with you. Actually, I think that if you can be presented with good art from the other side, that is extremely valuable, and people should pursue that. Like the harder part is when you're consuming new things that have just come out in the last year, you don't really know if it's good yet or not. But which is where a lot of these things come in. But like something that is known as just really good piece of art, a classic that written by someone who you don't like, I think that would be actually very good to seek out.
I say this because I guess this is such a big deal to me because I feel like in any kind of Egan school, the high school curriculum, not all of it, some of it's going to be science, some of it's going to be, science can get contentious, obviously, some of it's going to be math or whatever, but like significant swaths of the high school curriculum are going to be experienced by a lot of people as these are the most horrific ideas ever. Why would you want children to ever hear about these things?
Oh, really? Like which ones?
I mean, like you need to, okay. How careful do I need to be here? I'm not going to be very careful, right? Like you need to be reading things that like some people in the community, like their uncles at the very least, like might say their proverbial uncles, are going to say, what? That's woke nonsense, right? Like you're going to actually have to be reading, economic leftists. You're going to have to reading Ayn Rand. You're going to have to read Thomas Sowell. You're going to have to read, the Black Panthers, right? You're going to actually have to read people who, because of their ideas and their advocacy for their ideas, and sometimes because of, the fact that they literally pulled triggers while pointing guns at other people, killed people, are complicit in the actual deaths of people. Like you have to understand, like, what is it that is driving the Nazis in order to really understand the world? We have to actually get inside of like, what did it feel like to be a Soviet officer who is liquidating I don't know how to pronounce that word, kulaks, who is starving like the productive bourgeoisie out of their communities and watching their children die, and to be doing it because you're trying to make the world a better place. We have to like advertise that, like, like in order to really understand, in order to really like have an understanding of ideas and to know that your ideas are your own, you have to have tangoed with ideas that lots of people, most people now with some of these ideas, virtually all people say are evil ideas, the ickiest of the icky. So I guess that's why that's a big deal to me.
Okay.
No, I like that. I think I certainly never read if any, Nazi officers wrote autobiographies of their time, during the Holocaust, I certainly never even heard of those books. I'm sure they're out there actually. And that might have been a really compelling parallel to read along with, I'm going to say his last name wrong, Elie Wiesel?
Yeah, Wiesel is how I've heard that pronounced.
Yeah. I mean, so reading those two books as, one summer reading assignment or something would have been quite the undertaking. I wonder at what age group that would be most valuable. Probably high school, like you said. But yeah, no, that depends that's interesting
on it, right? Like it depends on how evil the ideas are. I'm writing down right now restricted section, right? Like maybe what an Egan school would want to have for the high schoolers, or is a restricted section where it's like, yep, like these are the books that people really fight about. Yes, we know that by restricting them, we're going to make them more popular.
And that's the point.
We want to. Yeah, we actually want to, but we also want to acknowledge that these are really controversial books. Probably it's a stupid idea, but it's a piquant idea, so I kind of like it from that. The book, by the way, to read if you're interested in the what were the Nazis, like what drove the Nazis. I mean, obviously you're talking millions of people, but is one of the books that changed my life was Evil Inside Human Violence and Cruelty by the great psychologist Roy Baumeister, which has a framework that says, okay, like when we look at like really, really terrible things, we can probably postulate that they are caused by one of these four basic human psychological drives, systems. And we can then, so each of those gets a chapter, and then there's a couple different sort of interpersonal dynamics that can bring people from light evil into horrible evil. So those get a couple more chapters if I'm remembering that correctly. Highly recommended.
Awesome.
Well, on that note, we're probably going to have to wrap up here real soon because I got to get going. But Stephen, I think you had some notes too that I'm not sure if we got to the things that you wanted to touch.
I think we talked about them all last time, actually.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, I have one last thing that I really, really wanted to ask about before we end all this. You said something about Eganizing is eating the world. What the heck does that mean?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think the way that I think about what a terrible way of opening a sentence. I think the way that I think about my own metacognitive aspects of I talked to a lot of teachers, and the problem that they have, I say this as a fellow teacher, but that they have is, okay, like here's this thing, I'm supposed to teach it, here's a lesson, I need to make this lesson interesting. How do I make this lesson interesting? And, okay, like, so it's, I don't know, pick some stupid, boring, long division, like the metaphor, the way that we do, the method that we do for long division. Okay, right, like, you need to teach that. Okay, so like, how does one Eganize it? And you say, okay, like what is, like, let's learn a heck of a lot about this thing. Let's learn where this algorithm comes from. Let's learn at what came before it and what it was thought to be the better, the successor to. Let's look at alternate methods of this maybe. Let's look at like if we know the person who invented, like, like the first you start with this number and then you see how many times the divisor can go into the dividend or into the whatever. I can never remember those words. Let's look into the person who made that. If in fact, like he or she has a name, if they don't, or even if they do, let's like look at the cultural situation that they were living in. Like what was math? Like what was going on with math at the time? Okay. So like you go deep into it and you find like, what is like, for me, the deep human value. What makes this exciting? What makes this electric? What makes this shiny? Egan, this is what Egan means by the word imagination, right? Like what's like captures your own imagination about this. And then you say, okay, so now that I know like what sort of like woof I want to help bring the kids to in this, what are the tools that they're pretty good at, the cognitive tools they're pretty good at that I can use, like bring this thing out, right? So like you identify like, what is the emotional binary of this, right? Like, is it like stinginess versus generosity? Is it good versus evil? Is it freedom versus oppression? Is it whatever?
We're still talking about long division.
Yeah, right. Like, so I'm embarrassed to say that I don't actually know where the long division thing comes from, but I can imagine that I know enough about the history of mathematics that like when like before the Greeks, like people were able to do tricks to divide by 5 and by 10 and by 2 and by 4 and whatever, but like they didn't know how to do 7. They didn't know how to divide anything by 7. So like you had to make these like really roundabout ways of doing it, right? So I'm imagining that like the long division algorithm is this way of like just like crunching any effing number and dividing it by any other effing number, right? So maybe like the binary there is something like these bespoke set of tools, that you have to be sort of this, there's an artisanal tastes in, versus a machine that will crush any math problem that you put, any two numbers that you wish to divide into each other. Okay, so now that I have that kind of binary of like nimbleness and like brute force, how can I explain this? Okay, right. Sorry. So I realize that I'm going too much into detail in this, but it's this way, Eganizing is this way of looking deep into the thing that you want to explore with somebody and say, what is already implicit in this thing that we want to learn as a cultural artifact, or about the universe or whatever. Like, how can we feel about this and what can help us feel about this? And then instead of saying, all right, everyone, I've come up with this simplified way. First, you do this, then you do this, then you do this, right? I used to teach kids to do long division, like the simplest possible sort of algorithmic way. There's a little mnemonic for it. It was stupid. It was fine. It was okay. But it's so much easier if you like tap into the deep human meaning implicit into it. Okay, so what do I mean when I say that Eganizing is eating the world? I think it was Richard Hanania who wrote that like politics has become stupider in the last 10 years because people who used to watch professional wrestling are now following politics because certain political entrepreneurs realized that they could get more votes, and people in the political media realized they could get more eyeballs if they could find what is the deep human meaning in politics and trade disputes or whatever, right? Boring, yawn. Why would you start the Star Wars saga with a trade dispute? But you can find the deep human meaning in that. You can like exaggerate it. You can help people feel it as if it is a life and death thing personal to them. And this is what's happening in politics. This is what has been happening in politics, where everything feels existential. This is what is happening in all aspects of what we now just call social media, where we say that everything is becoming shinier, everything is becoming harder to look away from. And it's not just because there are more colors and they're moving faster and we all have VR goggles glued to our heads, right? It's also because like people who could have been historians, and I'm not saying that they should have been, but like people are doing with social media, they're in other media, they're tapping into these deep human things. And using it to sell shitty products, and to argue for ideas of dubious truth value. The market has locked onto what I call Eganizing, and education is barely even recognizing that this is a game that they can play too. That in fact, educators are sitting on top of the grand store of all of the accumulated wows that any human being has ever figured out. In education, we have the shiniest shinies, and we are, talking about what brand of textbook should we be having in our kids' classrooms. Right. Stupidest debates, and everyone is just letting the marketplace go and Eganize itself, and we're not doing it for education. Yeah.
Damn. I want to. This is probably going to be a whole different podcast, so maybe we should have you back sometime in the new year. I kind of want to ask if you have thoughts on how to address this, or have found anyone who does have thoughts about it. And honestly, we don't have time for a full answer, but like in broad strokes, not in broad strokes, as a yes or no question, do you have thoughts that we should explore in the future?
Yes, and I this afternoon, actually, am kicking off a new JAG on my Substack that specifically tries to answer that question.
Well, hot damn. This timing could not be better. Well, thank you once again for joining us. This has been a sprawling conversation that I just found amazingly fascinating. You are so much fun to talk to.
Yeah, seconded.
You guys were too. I loved this, and thank you for pressing me on these things. Can I say, if we were to ever do this again, press me more? Like, just go to the comment section of the original book review that I was part of the book review contest, and like you will see a lot of like really critical takes on the things that I say. So feel free to just like copy from those if you'd like, or like attack like the notion of, is it really possible to make schooling wonderful? Because I think a lot about that. And frankly, I could stand to have more press back on that.
All right, I'll do my best. I imagine a lot of the pushback you got was from teachers or something, which I'm not qualified to speak on exactly how they feel. But yeah, no, I'll read through those and I'll read some of your blog posts too and find some of if there's any argument there, I'll try my best to bolster them and come at you real good.
Inish, I want to ask this question before we probably move into like we're going or after talking. Can I buy your book? Do you have a print book or is it just an ebook?
I do have a print book. It's available actually at a number of sellers, but the big one is Amazon. If you go to Amazon, you can buy a print version of both my short story collection and my full-length novel.
I realized talking today, I actually had like been meaning to read more of his short stories, especially the one that you'd mentioned, The Friends We Made Along the Way. And I thought, I should ask him about this. And everyone who's listening to the podcast should know about this. Once again, you guys do not self-aggrandize enough.
Okay. Well, the real fanfic is The Friends We Made Along the Way is not available in print. That's only available online, so you'd have to search for it. But I do have a plan to sometime in the first quarter of next year, put out another short story collection, which will include it in print. So that's coming.
Okay. In time for Christmas?
Oh, definitely not. Well, I mean, in time for Christmas of next year, yes, but not this year.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming back, Brandon. This was a lot of fun. I've enjoyed every conversation we've had and look forward to more.
Hell yes, me too.
Thanks very, very much.
Oh, any last thing you wanted to say or plug before we go? You do have your losttools.substack, and you have Science is Weird, which looks to be just amazing for kids ages 8 to 18.
I put way more work into the Science is Weird curriculum. And I, like, at some point, it would be a delight to talk with you guys specifically about what I believe to be possible in science education, using Egan, because I think that I think that it's huge, and I think that I can speak in lots of specifics in a way that illuminates the whole picture of what schooling can be. But in a way that I think that your audience will particularly find interesting.
Fantastic.
Awesome. Sounds great.
All right. Thank you again for joining us, and we will see everybody in 2 weeks.
Sounds good.
Bye.
Bye.
Stephen, welcome back. We are doing the next part of the podcast now.
That's right. Low Strong Posts.
I found these two interesting because at first when I was reading them, I'm like, why all this math? What does this have to do with Human's Guide to Words? But like then when we get to the end, there's a massive payoff. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, this totally made sense.
That was my exact experience reading them as well. I think, Yudkowsky was reading math books since, I think he was single-digit years of age. So I think he typical minds a little bit on how much the rest of us enjoy math. But that said, it's not like this is exactly hard to follow, and it's not valuable. But you can be darn sure that I've never calculated entropy, with binary code. Nor will I probably ever. But now I know that I can if I ever need to.
I think it may be less typical minding and more aiming for a specific audience.
Yeah, that makes sense. Still, I'd like to feel included. So,
I mean, we can look in from the outskirts.
Yeah, that's true. We're not mathematicians, but it's not just mathematicians.
Yeah, sometimes we play ones on TV, and that's close enough.
Right.
So entropy and short codes starts out with postulating a system X that has 8 possible states that are equally likely, and introduces a definition of entropy which was new to me. I don't know where this comes from specifically, but entropy of this system is 3 bits, which means that on average we have to ask 3 yes or no questions to find out X's value.
Yeah, the use of the word entropy, I'm sure, is technically correct, because I can't point to an example where Yudkowsky ever has something written here that is technically incorrect.
Yeah, like in some math way.
Right, exactly. But I've never come across this use of entropy elsewhere in my life. Usually it's meant to just be, well, I guess it is a measure of the disorder in a system, which if you squint, you can make more orderly by learning more about it. So, yeah, it's just I never usually hear it talked about that way.
But basically, when the 8 possible states are all equally likely, with each yes or no question, you can eliminate half of them, which is how it takes 3 bits to get to the answer that you want.
Right.
Then he says, suppose a system Y that has 4 possible states, but they aren't all equally likely. The first one is 50% likely, the next one 25%, and then the last 2 are both 12.5% likely. He says that the entropy of Y would be 1.75 bits, meaning that we can find out the value by asking 1.75 yes or no questions, and then goes on to describe what this means. Since the first option is 50%, you can get rid of 50% of the entropy with a single question that will eliminate the other 3 answers if number 1 is yes. So half the time, you only have to ask 1 question. And then 25% of the time, you can ask 2 questions to locate the answer that you want. And then the other 25% of the time, you have to ask a 3rd question to differentiate between the last 2 states. So on average, it all comes out to 1.75 questions that you have to ask if you have to repeatedly query this sort of system.
Right. This is one of those cases where, like, I'm glad I read the post rather than listen to it. Because these ones this is hardly like one of the mathiest ones, but the mathier ones are hard to listen to. Having the little chart, what do you call that? Infographic? I don't know. 2-line Excel spreadsheet. Really helps pin this out, because my first thought is, how do I ask 0.75 of a question? What is 3/4 of a bit? But no, he's saying on average, and that makes sense. And then when he's talking about code transmission, as compactly as possible. I'm like, oh, I see where this is going now. Okay, gotcha. The point is that you reserve short words for things that you'll need to say frequently, and longer words for things that you won't need to say as often.
Right, because you got to assign a code to each possibility. You assign the short codes to the ones that happen most often, because that helps to differentiate them from the more uncommon ones easily. You can more quickly distinguish them than by using a short code for all of them, which, boils down to the words thing, as you just said.
Yeah.
I thought one of the interesting points to all this is that when he says, when you take this art to its limit, the length of the message you need to describe something corresponds exactly or almost exactly to its probability, which is kind of neat.
I'm going to just take his word for that. So, and I think he fleshes that out a bit more in the next post. I didn't spend any time trying to think of counterexamples where, and I think he talks about it too, is that's like a formalization of Occam's razor. Part of what it means to be parsimonious with your explanation is that you're not introducing a bunch of extra information. And the more extra information you do introduce, the less likely it is. Try to explain everything we observe in the sky with the observation of the planets wandering and stuff. You've got to really, really squint and make a lot of confusing inferences. Or you can just say, oh, it looks like we all go around the sun, actually. And that explains it perfectly.
Yeah.
That's a good example.
It is. When I was reading this, it totally reminded me of when we were reading Plane Crash.
Yes.
And they're very frequently going back to very large concepts having very short words, because apparently, like in Dot the Line, people just use these concepts so freaking often. The frequency of how often you run into it is directly proportional to how short the word is.
I think we did talk about that. And that was probably mentioned in the book, too.
Well, then good. We're good readers.
Well, no, it was a while ago, but I think that was one of the things that Keltham lamented a lot, was like, oh, you guys don't have a word for this. Okay, well, then we'll use these long words for it. So I think that was kind of like an explicit criticism of his, is that this language doesn't seem like it's designed in a way that makes the kinds of conversations he's trying to have easy.
And that these concepts simply aren't used by these people very often, which probably was insane making for him, because he'd be like, these are the most fundamental concepts for thinking sanely about the world.
Right.
How can you just not use them?
I'm sure there's a 3-syllable word for, basic level categories having short names. That is actually 2 concepts. Basic level categories is probably a single-syllable word.
Yes. Yeah, that was a thing pulled out near the end there, that basic level categories in our language tend to have very short names, and nouns with short names tend to refer to basic level categories.
chair versus recliner versus furniture, etc.
Yeah. I also pulled out this one thing where he points out that I can define a word any way I like obstructs the art of carving reality at its joints, and likewise, the sensible sounding, the labels we attach to words are arbitrary, obstructs awareness of compactness, which we get more detail about that in the next post.
Yeah, I liked the ending of this post has a fun, a lot of them have fun little last closing zingers. Or, as Douglas Hofstadter put it, there's a reason why the English language uses "the" to mean "the" and anti-disestablishmentarianism to mean anti-disestablishmentarianism instead of anti-disestablishmentarianism other way around.
Yes.
The fact that I stumbled over that, I'm going to go ahead and just own, because that word's long and complicated on purpose. I believe it is the longest word in the language, right?
Oh, I have no idea.
I think it's the longest word in English. I think that's why he used it.
Ah, okay, cool.
And I'm running a quick science here, or I guess you can call it that, to test the idea that common words are short in other language, or like in language on purpose. Skimming across 15 or so just now, the word water looks like it's 1 or 2 syllables in all the languages that have letters that I can read, which is pretty cool. Because water is a thing, every language would want to be able to talk about. Oh yeah, and if you look at some of the ones that are using non-English or Roman letters, it actually gives me the English pronunciation underneath it. Mm-hmm. So let me find one here. Let's look at Japanese. Mizu. All right, yeah. So 1 or 2 syllables, it seems like, for everyone that I checked.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of cool.
That is, yeah. I'm sure there's got to be outliers, and it would be interesting to find out what those exceptions are and why they are.
Yeah, when I live forever, I'll get super into learning languages and learning about them, just because it is fascinating.
Yeah. But we are not living forever today, so not today.
Not today, unfortunately. We've got to talk about mutual information and density in thing space.
Yeah! All right, so we were talking about single systems before. What if you got 2 systems? Like X has 8 states, Y has 4 states. What's the entropy of the combined system X and Y? Basically,
are they related or not? First question, right?
There we go, yeah. You would assume 5, but if they're entangled in some way, we're learning something about Y tells us something about X, then you can do it with less bits. He supposes that if, for example, like if both X and Y are either both odd or both even, then you can do it with 4 instead of 5.
Right.
So, basically, there is 1 bit of mutual information between those 2 systems. Learning what X is gives us 1 bit of information about Y. We boil down a little bit. After you learn Z, your beliefs about Y is just what it was before, is equivalent to saying that learning about Y never tells you anything about Z, or vice versa. And so there's no mutual information between Y and Z, and where there's no mutual information, there is no Bayesian evidence, and vice versa.
Right.
We're getting into that because if there is an unusually high probability of Z plus Y, defined as a probability that's higher than the marginal probabilities would indicate by default, it follows that observing Y is evidence that increases the probability of Z, and symmetrically observing Z must favor Y.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fun example today. Like the sun out is evidence that it's warm out, right?
Mm-hmm.
It turns out today the sun just came out like half an hour ago and it's still 20 degrees, but it's still positive evidence, right?
Yeah.
The snow on the ground is strong counter evidence.
Yes. The reason he brings up all these entangled things is because as we go back to words now, the question comes back to, like, why do you want a word for human? He pulls back to a few earlier episodes where we defined human as a mortal, featherless biped. Why not just say mortal, featherless biped all the time? And part of it is because it's helpful to have shorter words for things that you encounter often. But if your code for describing these things is efficient, there wouldn't be a special advantage to having a special word for a combination like that, unless it's more likely for the combination of mortal and featherless and biped to be more common in combination than you would expect just from those things separately.
Yeah. Mortal featherless biped is a whole 5 syllables longer, and as we're coming to articulate with I guess mathematical proof, that's no coincidence, right? Yeah, and since he's saying that, like, if you observe Y, when they're entangled, if you observe Y, that increases the probability of Z. If a word is a good word, like human, then that means that if you observe featherless biped, that increases the probability that it will also be mortal. And that is where there's real utility in having words like this.
that having a word for a thing rather than just listing its properties is a more compact code precisely in those cases where we can infer some of those properties from the other properties.
So I think this actually is the sentence that, because I always try to, going through these, doing these segments here, I'm always trying to zoom out and wonder, why is he writing this post? Because, I totally understood the human use of language sequence. It's important to know what the hell we're talking about, right? And no, you can't just use whatever words you want if we're all going to play on the same game, etc. But why talk about short distances or short communication lengths here? And I think that is part of it, because not saying to define any word you like, but it's helpful to have these shorthands. And so if we want to use a loaded word like intelligence, if we all kind of know what that means, it saves a lot of trouble than just trying to describe all the capabilities of ChatGPT.
Yeah.
You think that I'm on the right track there?
I do think you're on the right track.
Right.
I think the payload that we're about to get to right here is the thing that really made me have a whoa moment.
All right, let's do it.
All right, so he says, so having a word Wigan for green-eyed black-haired people, as we discussed, I think 3 or 4 episodes ago in the Less Wrong sequences there, is more useful than just saying green-eyed black people precisely
black-haired people.
Oh, was I saying just black people?
The second time you did.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
It's more useful than just saying green-eyed, black-haired people, precisely when green-eyed people are more likely than average to be black-haired, and vice versa, or Wiggins share other properties that can be inferred at greater than default probability. And the example he used was really liking ketchup. Which means, here's the big one may even consider the act of defining a word as a promise to this effect. It asserts that the word Wigan will somehow help you make inferences and shorten your messages. If it is not the case that the word Wigan will do this, then the word Wigan is a lie. The word claims that certain people are worth distinguishing as a group, but they're not.
Yeah,
that's fascinating.
I like that. And it's there. We've talked a lot about what a group even means with edge cases and exceptions and stuff like that. But this is the kind of payoff of if you're going to make up a new term for, I don't know, an existent group of people or something, if it's not providing any new information, then it is kind of pointless, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure this actually works great when when a country's at conflict and you name the other group of people that you're fighting something, whatever it is, right?
Right.
So it's unless that gives us some sort of information, then it's not really helpful. In fact, it's counter helpful, because you're acting like you're giving us more information, but you're not.
Yeah.
In fact, you're giving us less, because Wigan doesn't mean anything unless, in this case, it means green-eyed, black-haired person. If you're not actually describing something worth describing, you're giving us less than you would have if you'd just given us the long description of it.
Yeah, because you made a promise to us, and that promise was not fulfilled.
Yeah.
That was a cool ass insight to me. The last thing I have here at the bottom is the way to carve reality at its joints is to draw your boundaries around concentrations of unusually high probability density in thing space. Just good advice.
Yeah, no, I like it. I always liked once it painted the picture for me whenever these ages ago was the mental picture of thing space. I picture basically the universe, with clusters and galaxies and whatever. And the more you zoom in, the closer you are to, picking out this particular couch, which is somewhere in the chair cluster, which is somewhere in the furniture cluster, which is somewhere in the solid objects you put in your house cluster, etc.
Yeah.
Kind of fun.
Well, Stephen, what are we reading for next time?
Next time, we're doing the super exponential concept space and simple words. Super exponential concept space is not simple words. I'm interested to see where that one goes. And this one, I do remember, one of my favorites, leave a line of retreat.
Ah, yes. Okay. The next thing we have to do is thank a patron, yes?
Oh my gosh, yeah. How could we almost forget?
I don't know. We almost do very frequently.
Which is weird, because it's the most important thing to us.
It really is.
Yeah, this episode, the most important thing is giving a shout out to David Wilkins.
David, thank you.
Total hero. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, all the standard stuff, which I hate just saying, but yeah, it makes a huge difference to us, and really is a motivator on days where I love doing this, but not every day do I love doing stuff. But on the days where I don't love doing stuff, these are big motivators. So knowing that people like David care enough to, or enjoy this enough to want to pay us to hear more, it's can I use the word motivating again without getting a English penalty.
It's fine with me.
All right.
Yeah, it really does help. And honestly, even if like someone is listening to this way in the back catalog 3 years in the past or in the future or whatever, and you kind of like some stuff and just want to subscribe for a month or two to support, 100 episodes ago, feel free to do that. Like, it doesn't matter if you're caught up or whatever. We really appreciate past support. Retroactive support from the past is just as awesome.
Yeah, I really wish Patreon had the ability to just let you log in and give money and then leave and like not do a subscription thing.
Yeah.
Because there are a handful of creators that I would totally just give $50 or whatever because I've listened to or enjoyed tons of their content. But like I don't want to remember to unsubscribe in 6 months or something.
We spoke briefly about setting up a Venmo. I should get around to doing that here in early January.
Yeah, we can do that literally whenever.
Also, the second favorite thing of us doing is talking about the Guild of the Rose.
Oh my God. Now I actually did forget to do that at this point. In our defense, we do the less long posts when we on days where we have guests. We typically do them on different days where we're recording the real episodes, so tad bit scrambled. But we do have to talk about Guild of the Rose, our favorite collaborators / partners in raising the Sanity Waterline.
They are not quite like what Brandon is doing with teaching people how to love knowledge and educate our kids. I think it's more aimed at adults and at rationalists who are at least in the young adult, if not later phase. Again, it is a teaching of skills and enabling people to do things better and to be passionate about improving themselves, which is basically what education is supposed to be, right?
Yeah, and they do it in a fun, gamified way. I mean, the path system is so cool. If anyone's listening and hasn't at least clicked the link in the description, I strongly encourage you to do so and just peruse for 5 minutes. It's really a great setup. They've put a lot of thought and time into this, and I strongly recommend it.
Me too. We believe in what they're doing, and that is why we partner with them. They're just helping to make the world a better place and make everyone who goes there stronger and better at doing, being effective in their life, being rational, applying the methods of rationality.
Yeah.
There we go.
Actually applying rather than just having fun with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totes.
Strong agree.
Thank you to them for helping support us and for helping to do the good work. Thank you to everybody here for listening. And I'm sure we said thanks to Brandon already when we interviewed him, but thanks again to Brandon for coming on.
Yeah, he came on again. It's great. We had a lot of fun the first time and we had more to talk about, so.
Yeah. And Stephen, thank you for always doing this with me. I would not be the same without you. Would be really kind of depressing.
Honestly, likewise. I mean to say that once in a while, and I don't know. I feel like it's implied, but it's worth making explicit. To be straightforward, there's no way I'd have the motivation to do this. It's kind of like having a gym buddy.
Oh, yeah.
It's like accountability. If this was just me, I totally would have pod faded 3 years ago. So
you would have what?
Pod faded.
Pod fade. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't know if that's a real word, but
no, it makes sense. Once you said it, I'm like, okay, I know what that is. Where the podcast just kind of less and less, and then they just stop altogether, and they never actually have a final signing off episode.
Exactly.
It's like ghosting for your parasocial relationships.
Right. Anyway, thanks, buddy. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you too. See you next time.
See ya.